They told us the forest was just trees, just trails, just silence. They were wrong. I've spent more nights in the backcountry than I can count, and I've seen things no ranger is ever supposed to report. Things that walk on two legs but were never human. Things that wear the faces of the lost. Things that whisper your name from the dark and know exactly when you'll turn around. Welcome back, Wanderer, to Mr. Belcho. If this is your first time at the campfire, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because every story I tell here actually happened to someone, a ranger, a hiker, a camper who never made it home. Now, before we begin, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? Because some of you are listening alone, and some of you only think you're alone. So lock your doors, turn off the lights, and stay close to the fire. The woods are about to start talking. The trail stretched out before me, winding through the dense Alaskan forest. Sunlight filtered through the canopy of spruce and hemlock, dappling the forest floor. I adjusted my heavy pack and checked my GPS. 10 miles to the next checkpoint. As a veteran park ranger, I was used to long solo patrols in remote areas, but this assignment was different. For the past month, hikers had been reporting strange sightings and encounters in this part of the park. Missing supplies, eerie howls in the night, fleeting glimpses of something large moving through the underbrush. The reports were vague but unsettling. Officially, I was here to investigate the reports and reassure the public that there was nothing to fear in the park. Unofficially, I knew things weren't quite right. There was a tension in the air, a watchfulness from the forest that raised the hairs on my arms and made me grip my bear spray a little tighter. I tried to shake off my unease as I made my way down the trail. It was a beautiful day, about as perfect as you could ask for in the Alaskan summer. But even the bright skies and bird songs couldn't fully lift the heaviness that seemed to hang over the forest. A twig snapped somewhere off the trail, loud in the stillness. I froze, scanning the dense foliage for any sign of movement. A bird darted from a nearby bush, making me jump. Get a hold of yourself, I thought. You've patrolled these woods 100 times. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as I continued down the path. The forest had a way of playing tricks on a lone hiker's mind. All I could do was stay alert and focused on placing one foot in front of the other. I had been walking for a few hours when I saw it. There, in the middle of the trail, was a large paw print pressed deep into the soft dirt. It looked canine, but was easily as big as my hand. I knelt down to examine it closer. The edges of the print were crisp and defined, like it had been stamped into the earth. I felt a chill skitter down my spine. No wolf or coyote left a print that large and clear. What the hell had made this? I looked up, scanning the forest with a growing sense of unease. Suddenly, the shadows between the trees seemed deeper, more concealing. I shook my head and stood up. I was letting my imagination run away with me. There had to be a rational explanation. Still, as I adjusted my pack and continued down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone in the forest. That something was out there, watching me from just beyond the reach of the shadows, waiting. The sun was starting to dip below the tree line when I came across the next set of prints. This time, there was an entire trail of them veering off the path and into the underbrush. My heart thudded heavily against my ribs as I crouched down to examine them closer. Like the first print, these were distinctly canine in appearance, but far too large to belong to any wolf or dog I had ever seen. And they seemed to be meandering through the forest rather than following any sort of game trail or natural path. As I straightened up, I noticed a flash of color caught on a nearby thorn bush. I moved closer and disentangled a scrap of bright blue fabric that looked like it had been torn from a backpack or jacket. My mind flashed to the reports of missing hikers. Was it a clue or just the leavings of a careless camper? Either way, I tucked the fabric into my pocket. The sinking feeling in my gut told me I should call this in, request backup. But I was still miles from the nearest cell signal, and the satellite phone in my pack suddenly felt like a flimsy lifeline. Besides, what would I even report? A bad feeling and some strange animal prints? I was so focused on the tracks that I nearly collided with the grizzled old man who stepped out from behind a large spruce tree. He regarded me silently, his weathered face impassive. "You're the ranger," he said finally, his voice low and gravelly. "Come to see about the sightings." It was more statement than question, but I nodded anyway. "That's right, Ranger Nolan Hayes." The man grunted. "Thought they'd send someone younger, someone who didn't know better, maybe." I bristled slightly at that. "I've patrolled this park for nearly a decade. I know these woods." He looked at me, shaking his head slowly. "Not these woods, son. There's things out here that don't care about your maps and trails and experience." A chill crept over me despite the warm evening air. "What kinds of things?" The old man glanced over his shoulder, peering into the dim forest. When he turned back to me, his eyes were hard. "Old things. Hungry things. Things that were here long before us and will be here long after." I swallowed against the sudden dryness in my throat. "You're talking about the animal attacks, the sightings." He barked out a harsh laugh. "Animal? Guess you could call it that. But you'd be wrong." He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "The tribes around here have stories, passed down for generations. Stories about a creature neither man nor beast, a shapeshifter. They call it the Kushtaka." The name sent a shiver down my spine, though I wasn't sure why. "The Kushtaka?" He nodded grimly. "A trickster spirit. Takes the form of a man or a wolf, depending on its mood. Lures travelers from the path." His eyes met mine. "Lures them to their doom." I tried to quell the unease rising in my chest. Native folklore was one thing, but I dealt in facts, not stories. "I'm just here to look into some strange reports. Missing food, tracks." The old man smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, I'm sure you'll find what you're looking for, Ranger, but you'd best be careful." He glanced back at the woods again. "The Kushtaka, it knows you're here now, and it's got a taste for those who tread where they ain't welcome." With that, he turned and melted back into the forest, leaving me alone with a growing sense of dread. As I stood there staring at the spot where he had disappeared, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I turned just in time to glimpse a dark shape slipping through the trees in the distance. It was only a moment, a blur of motion. But in that brief second, I could have sworn I saw the outline of something walking on two legs, hunched and inhumanly fast, something that seemed to swallow the fading forest light as it passed. Then it was gone, leaving me to wonder if I had actually seen anything at all. But deep in my gut, I knew the truth. There was something out there in the forest, and it was watching me. The sun had nearly vanished below the horizon by the time I realized I'd lost the trail. I checked my GPS again, but the screen just flashed an error message at me. No signal. I stared at it in disbelief. I could have sworn I'd been following the right path, using the landmarks to guide me. But now, I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The trees crowded close on all sides, casting long shadows in the dying light. They all looked the same to me now, just a dense sea of trunks and leaves. How had I gotten so turned around? An anxious sweat prickled along my hairline, despite the deepening chill of dusk. "Think," I told myself firmly. "You've been trained for this. Retrace your steps, find the trail again." But as I glanced behind me, my heart seized in my chest. My footprints were gone, not faded or hard to pick out in the dimness. Gone, as if they'd been swallowed up by the forest floor. My head swam as I tried to make sense of it. I knew I should stay put, make camp for the night. But the thought of hunkering down in this oppressive darkness, with God knew what prowling in the shadows, made my skin crawl. I forced my feet into motion, picking a direction at random. Better to keep moving than to just sit and wait for something to find me. But as I stumbled through the underbrush, strange sounds began to filter through the trees. At first I thought it was just the noises of the forest at night. The hooting of an owl, the skittering of small creatures in the brush. But then I heard something else. A voice. No, voices. Distant and distorted, but unmistakably human. They seemed to be coming from all around me, echoing weirdly in the gloom. "Hello," I called out, hating the tremor in my voice. "Is someone there?" The voices fell abruptly silent. For a moment, all I could hear was the thunderous pounding of my own heart. Then, from right behind me, came a single whispered word: hungry. I spun around, my hand scrabbling for the bear spray on my belt. But there was nothing there. Just the dark press of trees and shadow. Breathing hard, I turned in a slow circle, straining my eyes against the deepening night. I caught a brief glimpse of something pale moving between the trunks, there and gone again in a blink. "Who's there?" My voice sounded thin and reedy to my own ears. "Show yourself," a branch snapped behind me. I whirled to face it, stumbling back a step. My foot caught on something, and I looked down to see a scrap of fabric caught on a root. No, not just fabric. A backpack, torn and stained with something dark. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. It was the same shade of blue as the scrap I'd found caught in the thorn bush earlier, and it had been ripped to shreds, as if by claws. I looked up again, my heart hammering against my ribs. The night was silent now, watchful. I could feel unseen eyes on me from every shadow. I had to get out of these woods. Had to find my way back to the trail, back to civilization and sanity. But as I took a stumbling step, my eye caught on something else. There in the center of a small clearing, stones had been piled into a makeshift marker of some kind. A cairn. And atop it, like some kind of twisted trophy, was a human skull, bleached and grinning in the moonlight. A strangled sound built up in my throat as I staggered away from the gruesome totem. The old man's words echoed in my head. Lures travelers from the path. Lures them to their doom. Oh God, what had I walked into? I don't know how long I fled through the forest, blundering through the brush in a panic. All I knew was that I had to get away, far away from that awful scene in the clearing. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't seem to escape the feeling of being stalked, of being hunted. I finally stopped in a small hollow formed by the upturned roots of a fallen tree, gasping for breath. Moonlight slanted through the branches overhead, casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. With shaking hands, I shrugged off my pack and dug for my satellite phone. But as I flipped it open, my stomach clenched. The screen was cracked, the casing dented as if it had been crushed. It was impossible. My phone had been secure in my pack the whole time. But the evidence was right there in my hands, as damning as the shredded backpack in the clearing. I was alone out here, cut off from any help, and something had made sure of it. For a long time, I just sat there in the meager shelter of the fallen tree, my knees drawn up to my chest, listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet, like it was holding its breath, waiting. Then I heard it. A rustle in the brush, too heavy to be a squirrel or forest rat. Footsteps, circling just out of sight. There was something out there, pacing in the shadows at the edge of my hiding spot. Something big. Fear clawed at my throat as I reached for my bear spray with trembling fingers. I knew it was useless. Whatever was stalking me, it was no bear. Leave me alone. My voice cracked on the words. Just leave me alone. A low chuckle rolled out of the darkness, distorted and unnatural. It sounded like it was coming from more than one mouth. Alone, the voices hissed in sibilant unison. You are all alone now. No one is coming to help you. Icy sweat dripped down my back. It knew what I was thinking. It could sense my fear, my helplessness. A twig snapped, closer now. I could hear the rustle of leaves and ferns being pushed aside as something crept closer. In the darkness between the trees, a shadow moved, something huge and misshapen, loping on all fours. But as I blinked, the shape changed, rose up on two legs. It was a man. No, it wasn't a man at all. It was... The shadows moved again, and it was gone. But I could still feel it, circling, toying with me. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice raw with terror. The whispers came again, slithering out of the night. "You. We wants you." Then the forest erupted into cackling laughter, echoing from every direction, mocking, hungry. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the horrible sound. But it was in my head now, worming into my brain. The laughter faded as suddenly as it had begun, plunging the woods into silence once more. But I could still feel it out there, waiting, I huddled back against the meager shelter of the fallen tree and closed my eyes, praying for dawn. But I knew, deep in my bones, that the long night was only beginning, and it was hungry for more than my fear. Morning brought no relief. As the first gray light seeped through the trees, I forced myself to uncurl from my cramped position under the fallen log. Every muscle ached, my joints popping painfully as I stretched. I sat up, blinking against the watery dawn. The forest looked exactly the same as it had the day before, towering evergreens, ferns, and undergrowth, wisps of fog curling between the trunks. Almost peaceful. But I knew better now. I could still feel it, the crawling sense of being watched, of being stalked by something that defied natural law. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I slowly stood, scanning the shadows between the trees. There was no sign of the creature, no evidence of the horrors that had haunted the night, but I knew it wasn't gone. It was out there, waiting, hunting. I had to get out of these woods. I dug through my pack with shaking hands, searching for the map and compass. But as I pulled out the map, my heart sank. It had been shredded, torn to ribbons as if by razor-sharp claws. Desperately, I ransacked the rest of the pack. The food was gone, the wrappers scattered. The first aid kit had been gutted, the supplies strewn about. Even the emergency flares were crushed, leaking precious chemicals. I sat back on my heels, my breath coming in ragged gasps. It was toying with me, cutting off my escape, making sure I had no way to call for help or sustain myself, leaving me no choice but to play its twisted game. I didn't know if I could outrun it. I didn't even know what direction to go. But I couldn't just sit here and wait to die. I repacked what supplies I could salvage and shouldered my ruined pack. Then, choosing a direction at random, I set off into the woods at a quick jog. At first, the forest was quiet, still. But soon I became aware of a presence behind me, shadowing my every move. I didn't have to look back to know it was there. I could feel it, an almost physical pressure between my shoulder blades. Then came the whispers again, sibilant and mocking, shards of words and laughter flitting in and out of the shadows, stalking me. My pace quickened, my boots thudding against the spongy forest floor, faster and faster until I was running full tilt, clawing my way through the choking undergrowth. But no matter how hard I pushed myself, I could feel my unseen pursuer gaining. Hear its footfalls, not quite animal, not quite human, echoing behind me. I burst through a wall of ferns and skidded to a halt, teetering on the edge of a steep ravine. Far below, a river frothed white boulders, and fallen logs littered the slope, offering handholds and footholds. If I could just get down to the river, perhaps I could follow it out of these godforsaken woods. I turned to start climbing down, but froze. There, on the other side of the ravine, stood a creature straight out of a nightmare. It was vaguely man-shaped, but no man ever moved like that. Hunched and feral, loping on elongated limbs, matted fur covered its powerful body, a muddy blur of grays and browns. But its face, dear God, its face. One moment it was an animal, a wolf's muzzle and gleaming fangs. The next it seemed to ripple, the features running like wax, and it was almost human. A distorted parody of a face, grinning at me with sharp teeth. The creature, the kushtaka, threw back its head and howled, a sound that was both animal and eerily human-like. Then it crouched and sprang, launching itself across the ravine towards me. I scrambled back, lost my footing, and tumbled down the embankment. Rocks and branches tore at me as I rolled, my pack tangling around me. I fetched up hard against a boulder, the breath slamming from my lungs. Wheezing, I dragged myself upright, searching frantically for a weapon. My hand closed around a sturdy branch, ripped loose in my fall. I could hear the creature snarling as it half climbed, half fell down the ravine after me. I stumbled into the icy shallows of the river and turned to face it, branch raised. The kushtaka stalked out of the underbrush, its form shifting and blurring before my eyes. Now a bear, now a wolf, now something twisted and in between. Its eyes gleamed with feral hunger as it splashed into the river. I swung wildly as it lunged, barely dodging snapping jaws. The branch connected with a sickening thud, but the creature barely seemed to feel it. I scrambled backwards, the river rocks slick and treacherous beneath my feet. The kushtaka sprang, and I smashed the branch into the side of its head with every ounce of strength I had left. Something cracked. The branch or bone, I couldn't tell. The creature yelped and staggered back, shaking its misshapen head. Dark blood matted the fur around its temple. For a moment we faced each other, chests heaving. I raised the splintered remains of the branch, putting every last shred of defiance into my glare. Then the Kushtaka's form rippled one last time, and it turned, melting into the shadows of the forest as if it had never been. I stood there in the river for a long time, trembling with exhaustion and spent adrenaline. I had no illusions that I'd defeated the creature. I'd merely fought it to a temporary draw. I was bruised, bloodied, but still breathing. For now. Finally, I waded out of the frigid waters and limped downstream, following the course of the river. I didn't know if it would lead me out of the woods, back to safety and sanity. My pack was gone, along with most of my supplies. I had a single granola bar in my pocket, no map, no means to call for aid, but one thing I knew for certain. The Kushtaka was still out there. I could feel its malevolent presence watching from the shadows. This was far from over. The hunt had only just begun. The river flowed swift and deep, carving a winding path through the endless sea of trees. I followed its course as best I could, sometimes clambering over deadfalls and boulders when the banks grew too steep, but always keeping within sight of that silver lifeline. My whole body ached fiercely, the pain of my wounds throbbing in time to my stuttering heartbeat. The chill of my damp clothes sapped at my strength, my steps growing increasingly stumbling and uncoordinated. I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. Exhaustion dragged at me, black spots dancing in my vision. But every time I slowed, every time I thought about stopping to rest, I would feel it again, that skin-crawling sensation of being watched, stalked. So I pushed myself onward, half walking, half staggering through the woods as the sun began its slow descent towards the western horizon. I almost didn't see the cabin until I practically stumbled into the clearing. It was a small, rustic thing, all weathered logs and a sagging roof, half hidden in the shadow of an enormous old-growth spruce. A curl of wood smoke drifted from the cobbled-together chimney. For a long moment I just stared, certain my fatigued brain was conjuring up mirages. But the cabin remained, solid and real. A tiny oasis of civilization in the vast wilderness. I lurched forward on rubbery legs, hardly daring to hope. Even if the cabin was abandoned, it would still offer shelter for the night, a chance to dry out, treat my wounds, maybe even find some forgotten supplies. But as I neared the rough-hewn door, I slowed. Something felt off. A prickle of unease that had nothing to do with the strange events of the past day. The door stood slightly ajar, the cindered remains of a fire smoldering in the grate. But the clearing was utterly silent. Not even a bird or insect stirring, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Warily, I nudged the door open with my foot, tensed to bolt. But nothing lunged out at me from the dimness within. I could make out a small, one-room interior, a few pieces of rough-hewn furniture, a table, a chair, a narrow bed frame against the far wall. I stepped inside, and the metallic reek of old blood hit me like a slap in the face. I clamped my hand over my mouth and nose, fighting the sudden urge to gag. The cabin was a charnel house. Dark spray arced across the walls, splattered the floors. Sticky pools black in the fading light. Gouges marred every surface, deep and vicious, the sign of an incredible struggle. And there, in the center of it all, a body. What was left of one, anyway. Sprawled on the blood-soaked floor like a macabre centerpiece. Limbs bent at unnatural angles. Torso, a ravaged ruin of shredded flesh and splintered rib bones. The face. I looked away, bile searing the back of my throat. I'd seen animal attacks before. Grizzlies, mostly. But this was something else entirely. Something driven by a hunger beyond the natural. Other details slowly penetrated the shocky haze descending over my mind. A backpack, savagely torn and emptied, the contents strewn about. Shards of a smashed lantern. The splintered remains of a rifle stock, the barrel bent nearly in two. And tacked to one wall, ragged strips of paper, torn from a journal of some kind. The spidery handwriting marched brokenly across the blood-stained pages, increasingly frantic and disjointed. Rambling fragments about something in the woods, stalking, hunting, a shapeshifter, the Kushtaka. The last entry was just 2 words, scrawled in a shaking hand. It's here. A wave of dizziness crashed over me, and I stumbled back, out of the cabin, sucking in great shuddering breaths of the clean forest air. My mind reeled, trying to process the reality of what I'd just seen. The Kushtaka had been here. It had done this, left this nightmarish tableau like some kind of macabre warning. And now... A whispering sigh shivered through the trees, the forest letting out its pent-up breath all at once. I stiffened, the hairs on my nape prickling erect. No. Oh God, no. It couldn't be. But I could feel it, the weight of a bestial gaze heavy between my shoulder blades. Slowly, dreamlike, I turned. There, mere yards away at the edge of the clearing, crouched my nightmare-made flesh. The Kushtaka, risen from the lengthening shadows as if conjured by my horrified realization. Its outline wavered and blurred, shifting between wolf and man and something nameless in between. But its eyes, those remained constant, two pits of feral, malevolent intelligence boring into mine. I felt the scream rising in my throat, tasted the copper tang of terror on my tongue. But before I could make a sound, the creature smiled. A human smile, sharp and white and more terrifying than any animal snarl. It crouched, muscles bunching beneath its matted pelt, and sprang. The creature's lunge carried us both to the ground in a snarling, writhing tangle of limbs. I felt the hot stink of its breath, the needle prick of claws scrabbling against my arms and chest. I twisted frantically, trying to buck it off, but its weight pinned me like an insect. Up close, the Kushtaka was even more horrifying. Its body was a patchwork of fur and knotted scar tissue, skin splitting and bubbling as it flowed between shapes. The face that loomed over mine flickered from snapping jaws to almost human features, ravaged and distorted. Its eyes were the worst, a predator's eyes, but gleaming with a feral, alien intelligence. I flung up my arms, trying to shield my face and throat, but the creature merely huffed a laugh. It seized my wrist in a grip like iron, slamming my hand to the muddy ground. Its other hand, a twisted mockery, somewhere between paw and grasping fingers, closed around my throat, claws pricking the vulnerable skin. "Fool," it hissed, the words emerging in a distorted growl. "Did you really think you could escape us?" I gaped up at it, my mind shorting out in sheer, blind panic. I'd known the creature was intelligent, cunning beyond any ordinary animal. But this, to hear it speak, to hear the cruel amusement in its snarling voice. "What are you?" I managed to rasp, the words choked and thin. The Kushtaka's lipless mouth split into a sharp grin. "I am hunger," it said. "I am the wild, the untamed, the forest and all its secrets. And you?" Its claws dug into my throat, a stinging pressure. "You are my prey." I shuddered, trying desperately to think through the haze of pain and fear. Keep it talking, I thought wildly. If I could just stall, just buy myself a few moments. "Why?" I ground out. "Why me?" The creature cocked its head, considering. For a moment its features seemed to ripple, and I caught a glimpse of a face I recognized. The old man from the trail, the one who'd first spoken of the Kushtaka. Then it was gone, and the beast was grinning its fang-filled grin again. "Because you came looking," it said, almost gently. "You sought out the mysteries of these woods, pried into things best left alone. And now you will join us." Us. The word lanced through me like an icicle. There was more than one of these things. Of course there was. I'd walked into the den of what? A pack of monsters, shapeshifters, things that could wear the faces of their victims, that had been wearing them for God knew how long out here in the deep woods where no one would ever find them. The image of the ravaged body in the cabin flashed behind my eyes again, a promise of the fate that awaited me. I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't. I felt the old ranger's calm settle over me, that preternatural focus that had seen me through more than one life-or-death scrape in the wild. The pain and terror receded to a distant buzz, my attention sharpening to a laser point. I still had one ace up my sleeve, or rather, one small canister of bear spray hooked to my belt, wedged beneath my spine by our struggle. If I could just get to it. "Enough talk," the Kushtaka growled. "It is time to end this hunt." It reared back slightly, its jaws yawning wide. I saw my death written in those gleaming fangs, in the hellish light of its eyes. And I moved. I thrashed like a man possessed, bucking and twisting. The creature snarled, its grip on my wrist spasming. I wrenched my arm free and groped desperately for the bear spray. My fingers brushed the canister, closed around it. I ripped it free of my belt and jammed it into the Kushtaka's face, mashing down the trigger. A stream of capsaicin mist blasted from the nozzle, dousing the creature's muzzle and eyes. It shrieked, an awful, high-pitched sound no human or animal throat could produce. Its clawed hands flew to its face, and I heaved with all my strength, throwing it off me. I scrambled to my feet as the Kushtaka writhed and flailed, pawing at its burning eyes. Amber fluid streamed from its nostrils, its screams morphing into retching, agonized chokes. For a moment I stood frozen, staring at the thrashing figure. It seemed smaller somehow, diminished, like a nightmare exposed to the harsh light of day. Then the creature shuddered and lashed out blindly, catching me a glancing blow across the thigh. Its claws shredded through fabric and skin, and I yelped, staggering back. That snapped me out of my paralysis. I gritted my teeth against the flare of fresh pain and lurched into a stumbling run, crashing through the brush in a blind panic. I had to get away, had to put as much distance as I could between myself and the Kushtaka before the spray wore off. I had no idea where I was going, no direction except away. Branches whipped at my face, undergrowth snagging my feet. My lungs burned and my leg throbbed where the creature had scored me. But I ran, heedless of the blood spotting my trail, the pain shrieking in every labored breath. I ran until the forest blurred around me, until exhaustion turned my limbs to rubber and my heart felt like it would burst in my chest. And still I ran, the creature's vengeful howls dogging my steps. I ran until I couldn't run anymore. I half fell, half crawled into a narrow space between the roots of an enormous deadfall, wedging myself as far back as I could. The ancient tree formed a partial cage around me, a tiny shelter that was more psychological than practical. For a long time I just laid there, lungs heaving like bellows, trying desperately to quiet my ragged breathing. Every gasp sounded hugely loud in my ears, a beacon drawing my pursuer ever closer. But as the drumming pulse in my ears slowly faded, I realized the forest had fallen silent again. No howls or snarls, no crash of underbrush signaling a relentless approach. Even the normal night sounds seemed muted, hushed, like the whole world was holding its breath. Carefully, I reached down and probed the burning slash across my thigh. My jeans were shredded, blood welling between the flaps of denim, but the wound seemed relatively shallow, the bleeding already slowing. I gritted my teeth and yanked a strip of fabric free, binding the gash as best I could. It would have to do for now. Gingerly, I army crawled to the lip of my shelter and peered out into the gloom. There was no sign of the Kushtaka, no telling shimmer of a form slipping between the trees. For the moment, it seemed, I'd lost it. I slumped back against the reassuring bulk of the deadfall and closed my eyes. I had to think, to plan. I couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, exhaustion would drop me in my tracks, and then a shudder rippled through me. I clamped down on the thought. One problem at a time. Overhead, the sky was beginning to pale, dawn tinting the edges of the clouds. I watched the light seep slowly through the canopy, gilding the leaves and branches in trembling gold. It was strangely beautiful, that daybreak, a reminder that beyond the horror and darkness of the long night, the world kept turning. Light always followed shadow, but I couldn't wait for full light. I had to move, to put more distance between myself and the creature, while it was still blind and in pain. If there was any hope of escape, any chance to find my way back to the world of men and civilization, I had to seize it now. I pulled myself to my feet, grunting at the hot throb of protest from my savaged leg, but it held my weight, and that would have to be enough. I limped from the shelter of the deadfall, squinting against the brightening glare. I picked a direction at random and started walking, trying to move as swiftly and silently as my battered body would allow. The forest slowly came alive around me as color bled back into the world. Birds trilled and chirped in the branches, squirrels chittering their indignation as I passed beneath their trees. It all seemed so normal, so incongruously cheerful in the wake of the night's horrors. I walked for hours, pushing myself until my injured leg dragged like lead and my head swam with exhaustion. I chewed another strip of willow bark, the bitter sap dulling the knife edge of pain. I drank from streams, splashed the cold water on my face. And through it all, I felt the weight of unseen eyes on the back of my neck, heard the whisper of phantom footsteps that never quite caught up. The creature was still out there. I could feel it. But for some reason, it didn't attack, didn't close the final distance as I stumbled doggedly onwards. Maybe the bear spray had hurt it badly enough to make it wary. Maybe, like any predator, it was waiting for me to drop from exhaustion, presenting an easy kill. Or maybe it was just toying with me, drawing out the hunt, savoring the terror of its prey. The thought coiled like a snake in the pit of my stomach. The sun was directly overhead, beating down through the thinning foliage, when the trees abruptly ended and I found myself standing at the edge of a road. An honest-to-God road, rough gravel and faded yellow lines. I stared at it uncomprehendingly. Had I really done it? Had I somehow stumbled out of the monster-haunted woods, back to the world of humanity? It hardly seemed real. A distant rumble reached my ears, growing steadily louder. I tensed, thinking for one sickening moment that it was the growl of the kushtaka. But then, an old green pickup rounded the bend, the Forest Service logo emblazoned on its dented doors. I waved my arms wildly, nearly weeping in relief. The truck pulled to a stop and a familiar figure stepped out, Jack, one of the older rangers from the station. His weathered face creased with concern as he took in my ragged appearance. "Christ almighty, boy," he said. "We've been looking everywhere for you. What happened?" I opened my mouth, a flood of words rising in my raw throat. But I hesitated, the horror and impossibility of the past days strangling the truth before it could pass my lips. What could I say? That I'd been stalked through the woods by a shape-shifting monster out of native legend? That I'd seen a man's mutilated corpse, been savaged and nearly devoured myself? It sounded insane even in my own head. "I got lost," I heard myself say, the words flat and unconvincing to my own ears. Twisted my ankle, took a fall by the river, and lost my gear. Jack's gaze sharpened, his eyes flicking to the bloody makeshift bandage on my leg, the scratches scoring my face and arms. I could tell he didn't believe me, not entirely, but he just nodded slowly. "Well, you're damn lucky," he said gruffly. "Could have been a hell of a lot worse. Come on, let's get you to the dock, get you checked out." He helped me into the cab, asking no more questions as he eased the truck back onto the road. I slumped bonelessly in the seat, fatigue crashing over me in a smothering wave. But as my eyes fluttered shut, I caught a glimpse of movement in the rearview mirror, a flicker of shadow between the trees, there and gone between one blink and the next. A dark shape, hulking and strangely fluid, watching from the forest's edge, watching and waiting. I knew then, with a bone-deep certainty, that it wasn't over. The kushtaka was still out there, lurking in the wildwood shadows. I had escaped, but only for now. One day, I would have to return. One day, the hunt would begin again. The truck rumbled down the road, carrying me back to the familiar world of paperwork and incident reports, fluorescent lights and the chatter of radios. But part of me was still out there in the woods, would always be out there, listening for the howl of a creature that was neither man nor beast. Waiting for the day when the kushtaka called me back to the savage dark of the forest. Back to the wild purity of tooth and claw and blood-drenched earth. Back to finish the hunt, one way or the other. There's something about the wilderness that calls to you, a primal connection that tugs at the edges of your consciousness. That's what I told myself when I agreed to this trip. 5 days of hiking and camping in the remote backcountry of northern Arizona, far from cell service, far from other people, far from safety. Just our small group, the towering pines, and the vast emptiness of nature. The idea originated with Liam and Bryce, my friends from Toronto who had been raving about American wilderness adventures for years. They'd been planning this particular excursion for months, poring over topographical maps and forums about a secluded lake nestled deep in the Coconino National Forest. The area wasn't on any tourist maps and required special permits, which somehow made it more alluring. Add in my Australian friends Ruby and Jasper who were visiting the States for the first time, and our little expedition was set. "The place is called Kaibab Lake," Liam explained as we loaded our gear into the rented SUV in Flagstaff. His tall frame bent awkwardly as he Tetrised backpacks into the trunk. The locals say it's one of the most pristine spots in the entire region. Ruby, her sun-browned face already glistening with excitement beneath her auburn hair, nodded enthusiastically. "I've been dying to see proper American wilderness. Australia's got the outback, but this is different, yeah? Ancient forests and mountains. Jasper, her boyfriend, was more reserved, methodically checking our supplies. "Did you pack the water purification tablets?" he asked me, his Australian accent thicker than Ruby's. "And the first aid kit?" I nodded, patting my backpack. "Got everything on the list, plus extra batteries for the headlamps." Bryce, who had been unusually quiet that morning, slammed the trunk shut. "We should get moving. It's a long drive to the trailhead, and I'd like to make it at least a few miles in before setting up camp." There was something in his expression, a tightness around his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. When I asked if everything was all right, he shrugged it off. "Just anxious to get going," he said, avoiding my gaze. The drive from Flagstaff took us deeper into the forest than I'd expected. The paved road eventually gave way to gravel, then to little more than a rutted path cutting through dense pines. Shadows lengthened as the afternoon stretched on, dappling the forest floor with patterns that shifted and moved with the wind. "Did you know this area has some of the oldest Native American settlements in North America?" Liam said, breaking the silence that had fallen over the car. "The Navajo and Hopi tribes have been here for centuries." "Millennia," Bryce corrected, staring out the window. "And they have stories about these woods, not all of them pleasant." Ruby leaned forward from the back seat. "Like what? Ghost stories?" I caught Bryce's gaze in the rearview mirror. For a moment, he seemed reluctant to continue. "Not ghosts," he finally said. "Something called Tse-Nidi, the one who crawls on all fours. The Navajo won't talk about them much. Bad luck to even mention them." "Skinwalkers," I said, the word emerging from some half-remembered documentary I'd seen years ago. Bryce nodded, his expression grim. "Yeah, not something to joke about around here." The mood in the car shifted subtly. Jasper cleared his throat. "Well, good thing we're just here for the hiking and fishing, right?" We arrived at the trailhead late afternoon. The small clearing could barely be called a parking lot, just a widened section of dirt with enough space for 2 or 3 vehicles. Ours was the only one there. "This doesn't look like a popular spot," Ruby observed as we unloaded our packs. "That's the point," Liam said with a grin. "We'll have the whole place to ourselves." I shouldered my pack, feeling the familiar weight settle against my spine. The forest stretched before us, the trail a narrow ribbon disappearing into green shadow. Birds called from the canopy, but otherwise the woods were unnervingly still. "According to the map, it's about 7 miles to the lake," Bryce said, checking his GPS. "We won't make it before dark. There's a small clearing about 3 miles in where we can set up for the night." As we started down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the trees. I glanced over my shoulder several times, but saw nothing except endless trunks and dancing shadows. The hike was more challenging than I'd anticipated. The trail wound steeply upward in places, crossing small streams and rocky outcroppings. By the time we reached the clearing Bryce had mentioned, the sun was sinking below the tree line, painting the sky in violent oranges and reds. "Let's set up before we lose the light," Liam suggested, already shrugging off his pack. The clearing was small but level, with enough space for our 3 tents. While Ruby and Jasper collected firewood, Liam, Bryce, and I assembled the shelters. The familiar routine was comforting: stakes driven into soft earth, poles threaded through sleeves, rain flies secured against the possibility of overnight showers. "Have you guys been here before?" I asked as we worked. Liam shook his head. "First time, but a guy in one of my hiking forums recommended it. Said it was untouched, pristine." "And isolated," Bryce added. "No rangers patrolling, no day hikers, just wilderness." As darkness fell, we gathered around the small fire Jasper had built. The flames cast our faces in flickering gold, creating more shadows than light. Above us, stars emerged in a dazzling display impossible to see from the city. "I've never seen stars like this," Ruby whispered, leaning against Jasper's shoulder. "It's like they're close enough to touch." We ate a simple dinner of dehydrated stew, the conversation flowing easily as we discussed our plans for the next day. But as the fire burned low and the night deepened, a strange tension crept in. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects chirping, no night birds calling, not even the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. "Is it always this quiet?" Jasper asked, glancing toward the dark wall of trees surrounding our small circle of light. Bryce poked at the embers with a stick. "Probably just the fire. Animals avoid it. But I could tell from his tone that he didn't entirely believe that. None of us did. I think I'm going to turn in, I said, standing and stretching my tired muscles. Long day tomorrow. The others murmured agreement, and soon we were zipping ourselves into our respective tents. Liam and Bryce in one, Ruby and Jasper in another, and me in the smallest one. Inside my tent, I listened to the others settling down, their voices muffled by nylon walls. Exhaustion pulled at me, but sleep remained elusive. The silence outside was too complete, too unnatural. And beneath it, I thought I could hear something else. A soft, rhythmic sound, like breathing, or footsteps, moving slowly around the perimeter of our camp. I told myself it was just the wind, or my imagination working overtime. But as I finally drifted toward sleep, a long, low howl broke the silence. Not a wolf or coyote, but something else. Something that raised the hairs on the back of my neck and sent ice down my spine. Something that sounded almost human. Morning arrived with fog hanging heavy between the trees, transforming the forest into a dreamscape of muted grays and greens. I emerged from my tent to find Bryce already awake, crouched beside a small fire, his face drawn and tired. "Sleep okay?" I asked, reaching for the coffee pot he'd balanced on a flat stone near the flames. He shrugged. "Not really. Kept hearing things." "Like what?" "Footsteps. Something circling the camp." He poked at the fire with a stick, avoiding my gaze. "Did you hear that howl last night?" I nodded slowly. "Thought it might be a coyote." "No coyote sounds like that." Bryce's voice was flat. "I know what I heard." Before I could respond, Liam emerged from their shared tent, stretching his long arms toward the sky. "Morning, campers. Everyone alive and uneaten?" His joke fell flat in the misty silence. Ruby and Jasper joined us shortly after, and we ate a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and dried fruit. No one mentioned the strange sounds from the night before, but I noticed how often their eyes drifted to the surrounding trees. "The lake's about 4 miles from here," Bryce said as we packed up camp. "If we make good time, we should reach it by early afternoon." The trail grew more rugged as we continued, climbing steadily upward through increasingly dense forest. The fog clung to the trees, creating pockets of near-zero visibility where the path ahead disappeared into white nothingness. "Stay close," Liam called back to Ruby and Jasper, who had fallen behind. "Easy to get turned around in this stuff." I was hiking just behind Bryce, close enough to hear when he muttered something under his breath. "What was that?" I asked. He glanced back, surprised. "Nothing, just talking to myself." But there was something in his expression, a wariness that hadn't been there the day before. Every few minutes, he would stop and listen, his head cocked slightly to one side. About 2 hours into our hike, the fog began to lift, revealing glimpses of blue sky above the canopy. The forest floor was carpeted with pine needles, making our footsteps nearly silent, which is why we all jumped when a branch snapped loudly somewhere off to our right. We froze in unison, 5 heads turning toward the sound. "Probably a deer," Jasper said after a moment, though he didn't sound convinced. "Too heavy for a deer," Bryce replied, his voice low. "Let's keep moving." We continued more quickly now, the easy conversation of the morning replaced by tense silence. Twice more we heard branches breaking in the forest, always just out of sight, always moving parallel to our path. "Is someone following us?" Ruby finally asked, giving voice to what we were all thinking. "Not someone," Bryce said. "Something." The way he emphasized the word sent a chill through me. I remembered our conversation from the car, the Navajo legends, the things that crawled on all fours. "We're almost to the lake," Liam said, his usual joviality strained. "Let's just focus on that." But as we rounded a bend in the trail, we found our path blocked by a strange arrangement of stones. They formed a rough circle about 3 feet in diameter, with what looked like animal bones placed carefully at cardinal points. Bryce stopped so abruptly that I nearly ran into him. "Don't touch it," he said sharply when Liam moved forward to investigate. "Don't even go near it." "What is it?" Ruby asked, peering around Jasper's shoulder. "Nothing good," Bryce's face had gone pale. We need to go around it, off the trail. Are you serious? Liam scoffed. It's just some rocks. It's not just rocks, Bryce insisted. It's a marker, or a warning. The tension between them was sudden and unexpected. I stepped between them, trying to defuse the situation. Let's just go around it. No harm in being cautious, right? After a moment, Liam nodded reluctantly. We gave the stone circle a wide berth, pushing through underbrush until we could rejoin the trail on the other side. Want to tell us what that was about? Jasper asked once we were moving again. Bryce hesitated, then sighed. My grandmother was Navajo. She used to tell stories about certain things in these forests. Signs to watch for. That circle back there, it's not a good sign. What does it mean? I asked. It means we're being watched, he replied quietly, and not by anything human. The rest of our hike passed in uneasy silence. The forest seemed different now, less welcoming, more watchful. I found myself scanning the trees constantly, jumping at every rustle of leaves or distant bird call. We reached the lake just after noon, emerging from the forest to find a pristine body of water nestled in a natural bowl of pine-covered hills. Under different circumstances, I would have found it breathtaking. Now, it just seemed isolated and exposed. There's a cabin on the north shore, Bryce said, consulting his map. Should be about half a mile around the lake. A cabin? Ruby perked up. You didn't mention a cabin before. Bryce shrugged. It's abandoned. Old Forest Service outpost or something. But it has 4 walls and a roof, which is better than tents if... He trailed off. If what? Liam pressed. If it rains, Bryce finished, though we all knew that wasn't what he'd been about to say. We followed the shoreline, our packs feeling heavier with each step. The lake water was crystal clear, reflecting the surrounding pines and the blue sky above. Too still, I thought. Not even a ripple disturbed its mirror-like surface. The cabin came into view as we rounded a small peninsula, a simple log structure with a sagging porch and a stone chimney. It looked ancient, as if it had grown from the forest floor like the trees around it. Home sweet home, Liam said with forced cheerfulness. As we approached, I noticed something hanging from one of the porch beams, a small leather pouch, weathered and cracked with age. Bryce saw it too and froze. Wait, don't go any closer. What now? Liam's patience was clearly wearing thin. That's a medicine bundle, Bryce explained, pointing to the pouch. It's protective magic. Someone put it there recently. Magic? Jasper raised an eyebrow. You're not serious. But Bryce's expression remained grave. My grandmother would hang these over doorways. They're meant to keep things out, things that mean harm. Well, that's comforting, Ruby muttered. After a moment's hesitation, we continued to the cabin. The door creaked open at Liam's push, revealing a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and a set of bunk beds built into one wall. Dust covered everything, but otherwise the cabin seemed intact. Not bad, Jasper said, dropping his pack on the floor. Beats sleeping in tents. We spent the next hour settling in, sweeping out the worst of the dust, gathering firewood, and collecting water from the lake to filter. All the while, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside, my eyes were drawn to the dark line of trees across the lake, searching for movement, for shapes that didn't belong. As dusk approached, we gathered around the fireplace inside the cabin. Outside, the forest had once again fallen unnaturally silent. So, Ruby said, breaking the tense quiet, is anyone going to talk about what's going on? We all looked at Bryce. After a moment, he sighed. I didn't want to freak everyone out, he began, but there are stories about this place, the lake, these woods. The Navajo call it To de Chini, the bitter water. It's considered haunted, I guess you could say. Haunted by what? I asked. Bryce's gaze flickered to the window where darkness was rapidly falling. By those who walk between worlds. The Navajo believe that certain medicine people, healers, shamans, can be corrupted. They perform a ritual, a terrible one, and it gives them power to transform, to take the shape of animals. Skinwalkers, I said again, the word tasting foul in my mouth. Bryce nodded. They're said to prey on travelers, on those who wander into their territory. They can mimic human voices, lure people away from safety. That's just folklore, Liam said, but his voice lacked conviction. Maybe, Bryce conceded, but something followed us today. Something placed that stone circle as a warning, and someone hung that medicine bundle on the porch to keep something out. We all fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the occasional settling of the old cabin's timbers. "What do we do?" Ruby finally asked, her face pale in the firelight. "We stay together," Bryce said firmly. "We don't go out alone, especially after dark, and we leave first thing in the morning." No one argued. As the night deepened, we prepared for sleep. The bunk beds could only accommodate 4, so I volunteered to take the floor, spreading my sleeping bag near the fireplace. Despite our exhaustion, conversation continued in low, nervous bursts, as if silence might invite something we didn't want to acknowledge. I must have drifted off eventually because I jerked awake to complete darkness. The fire had died to embers, casting just enough light to make out the shapes of my companions in their beds. Something had woken me, a sound from outside. I lay perfectly still, listening. At first there was nothing but the soft breathing of the others. Then I heard it again, a voice, barely audible, calling my name. "Hello?" it called, the word elongated and distorted, as if spoken by someone unfamiliar with human speech. "Is anyone there? I need help." I sat up slowly, heart pounding. The voice was coming from just outside the cabin near the lakeshore. "I'm hurt," the voice continued, now sounding eerily like Jasper. "Please, help me." I glanced toward the bunks. All 4 shapes were still there, including Jasper's. The thing outside was mimicking his voice. Cold sweat broke out across my skin as I remembered Bryce's warning. They can mimic human voices, lure people away from safety. "Wake up," I hissed, scrambling to my feet. "Everyone wake up now." They stirred groggily, confused by my urgency until they too heard the voice outside, now cycling through each of our voices in turn, calling for help, pleading. "What the hell is that?" Liam whispered, his face ghostly in the dim light. Bryce was already up, moving toward the window with cautious steps. He peered out into the darkness for a long moment, then quickly stepped back. "There's something on the shore," he said, his voice tight with fear. "Something watching the cabin." "What does it look like?" Ruby asked, clutching Jasper's arm. Bryce shook his head. "Too dark to tell, just a shape. But it's standing upright one moment, then on all 4s the next." The calling had stopped. In its place came a new sound, scratching, first at the windows, then at the door. Slow, deliberate, like claws or fingernails dragging across wood. "It knows we're awake," Bryce whispered. "It knows we won't be fooled." We huddled together in the center of the cabin, listening to the thing outside as it circled the structure, testing each possible entrance. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, occasionally punctuated by low, inhuman growls. None of us slept again that night. We kept the fire burning, speaking little, jumping at every sound from outside. And through the small, grimy windows, I could have sworn I saw eyes reflecting the firelight, too high off the ground to be any natural animal, watching us with patient, intelligent malice. Finally, as the first gray light of dawn filtered through the trees, the sound ceased. Whatever had stalked us during the night had retreated, for now. "We need to leave," Bryce said, voicing what we were all thinking. "Now, while it's light." No one disagreed. We packed quickly, leaving behind anything non-essential to speed our journey. As we stepped outside, the morning seemed mockingly peaceful. Birds singing, sunlight dappling the lake's surface. But there, in the soft earth around the cabin, were the tracks. Some looked like large wolf prints, others like bare human feet. In places, they merged and changed, as if the creature had transformed mid-stride. Ruby made a small, frightened sound when she saw them. "That's not possible." "We need to go," Bryce repeated more urgently. "Stay together, stay on the trail, and don't look back." We left the lake behind, moving as quickly as the rough terrain would allow. The forest that had seemed so beautiful just yesterday now felt oppressive, hostile. Every shadow might hide our stalker. Every bird call might be its mimicry. The day stretched on, the miles passing in a blur of fear and exhaustion. We didn't stop for rest, didn't separate even for bathroom breaks. Our only goal was to reach the trailhead, to get back to civilization and safety. But as the afternoon waned and shadows lengthened once more, I began to suspect we weren't going to make it out before nightfall. and from the grim expressions on my companions' faces, they knew it too. Whatever was hunting us was still out there, watching, waiting for darkness to fall again. Midway through the afternoon, the sky darkened rapidly as storm clouds rolled in from the west. What had been bright sunshine minutes before became gloomy twilight, casting the forest in premature shadow. "We need to move faster," Bryce urged, glancing nervously at the sky. "If that storm hits, we'll be in trouble." We picked up our pace, pushing tired muscles beyond comfort. The trail began to descend steeply, winding down through rocky outcroppings that became treacherously slick as the first raindrops fell. "How much further to the trailhead?" Ruby asked, her breath coming in short gasps. Liam checked the GPS. "About 4 miles. We won't make it before dark." The implications hung heavy in the air. None of us wanted to be in these woods after nightfall, not with what we'd experienced. The rain intensified, fat drops becoming a steady downpour that soaked through our clothing and turned the trail into a miniature riverbed. Water streamed down my face, blurring my vision and making each step a potential disaster. "We need shelter," Jasper called out as thunder rumbled overhead. "We can't hike in this." Bryce hesitated, clearly torn between the dangers of stopping and the risks of continuing in such conditions. Finally, he nodded. "There's an overhang about a quarter-mile ahead. We can wait out the worst of it there." The overhang proved to be a shallow rock shelter, not quite a cave, but deep enough to provide some protection from the rain. We huddled together beneath it, watching as sheets of water cascaded from its edge like a curtain. "Just a quick break," Bryce insisted. "As soon as it lets up, we keep moving." But the storm showed no signs of abating. Lightning split the sky in jagged bursts, followed by thunder that shook the ground beneath us. The forest beyond our small shelter had disappeared behind a wall of rain and deepening gloom. "I don't like this," Liam muttered, peering out into the deluge. "We're sitting ducks here." He was right. If the thing that had stalked us at the cabin was still following, we'd made ourselves easy targets. But what choice did we have? As if in answer to my unspoken question, a bolt of lightning struck terrifyingly close, illuminating the forest in stark white light. And in that brief flash, I saw it. A figure standing among the trees, barely 30 yards from our shelter. Not human, not animal, but something in between. Tall and gaunt, with limbs too long and joints that bent wrongly. In the split second of visibility, I could have sworn it was wearing the pelt of some large animal, the head serving as a grotesque hood that didn't quite hide the 2 human eyes beneath. Then darkness returned, and it was gone. "Did you see that?" I gasped, grabbing Bryce's arm. His face told me he had. "It found us. What do we do?" Ruby's voice shook with fear. Bryce reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch similar to the one we'd seen hanging at the cabin. "My grandmother gave me this before she died. Said it would protect me if I ever encountered." He didn't finish the sentence. "A good luck charm?" Liam scoffed, though his face was ashen. "That's your plan?" "It's not luck," Bryce said sharply. "It's protection. But it might not be enough for all of us." Another flash of lightning. Another glimpse of the figure, closer now, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. It seemed to flicker between forms, sometimes upright, sometimes crouched on all fours. "We need to run," Jasper said, his Australian accent thickened by fear. "Now, while we can still see it." "Run where?" Ruby demanded. "We don't even know which direction is safe." "Back up the trail," Bryce decided after a moment, "toward the lake." "The lake?" Liam stared at him in disbelief. That thing was at the lake. "The cabin had protection," Bryce reminded him. "That medicine bundle. It kept the skinwalker out last night. If we can get back there..." It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one we had. We gathered our packs with shaking hands, prepared to flee back the way we'd come. But as we stepped out from under the overhang, another flash of lightning revealed the figure standing directly in our path, blocking the trail back to the lake. "Other way," Bryce hissed, pushing us in the opposite direction. "Down toward the trailhead. Go." We ran blindly through the rain, slipping and stumbling on the muddy trail. The forest was a blur of gray and green, punctuated by lightning flashes that cast monstrous shadows among the trees. Behind us, I could hear something moving, fast, too fast to be natural, crashing through underbrush with single-minded determination. The trail forked unexpectedly, and in our panic, we hesitated too long. When we finally chose a direction, left, downhill, it was unclear if we'd made the right choice. "Does this lead to the trailhead?" Ruby shouted over the storm. No one had an answer. We were lost, being hunted, with night approaching quickly. After what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, we burst into a small clearing. In its center stood a dilapidated structure, not a cabin but an old ranger station, its windows boarded up, its door hanging askew. "In there," Bryce directed, already running toward it. The door creaked open at his push, revealing a single dusty room with a desk, some broken chairs, and cobweb-filled corners. Not much of a refuge, but better than nothing. We piled inside, slamming the door behind us. Liam and Jasper dragged the desk across the floor, barricading the entrance as best they could. "Will it hold?" Ruby whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Before anyone could answer, something hit the door with tremendous force, making the entire structure shudder. The desk scraped back several inches despite Liam and Jasper's weight against it. "It's trying to get in," Jasper grunted, pushing back. Another impact, stronger this time. The wooden walls creaked ominously, dust raining down from the ceiling. Bryce pulled out his medicine pouch, muttering words in what I assumed was Navajo. Outside, the pounding suddenly stopped. For a moment, we dared to hope that whatever protection the pouch offered had worked. Then came a new sound, scratching at the boarded windows, exploring the structure's weaknesses. "It's looking for another way in," Bryce said, moving to stand beneath one of the windows. We spread out, each taking a potential entry point to guard. The scratching continued, methodical and patient, moving from window to window. Then silence. Complete, heavy silence that somehow felt worse than the assault. "Where did it go?" Ruby whispered after several tense minutes had passed. A thump on the roof answered her question. Slow, deliberate footsteps tracked across the ceiling, testing, probing. "The chimney," Bryce suddenly realized, pointing to the small fireplace in one corner. "Block it." Liam was closest. He lunged for the fireplace just as something dark and reeking of decay began to squeeze through the narrow opening. He grabbed a broken chair and shoved it upward into the chimney, earning an inhuman shriek of rage from whatever was trying to enter. The thing retreated, but the assault on the building intensified. It seemed to be everywhere at once, scratching at the door, the windows, the roof. The old structure groaned under the attack, boards splintering, nails working loose. "It's going to get in," Ruby sobbed, pressing herself into a corner. "It's going to get in." Bryce moved to the center of the room, still clutching his medicine pouch. "Everyone, get behind me. Form a circle, back to back." We did as he instructed, forming a tight knot in the middle of the room. Outside, the storm raged on, rain pounding the roof in sheets, lightning illuminating the cracks between boards where something watched and waited. "What happens if it gets in?" Jasper asked, his voice barely audible. Bryce didn't answer. He didn't need to. We all knew what would happen. The attack paused again, the silence stretching out unbearably. Then came a new sound, a voice just outside the door. "Help me," it called, and with horror I recognized my own voice, perfectly mimicked. "Please, I'm hurt. Let me in." When no one responded, it tried again, cycling through each of our voices in turn, pleading, begging for help. The imitations were flawless, indistinguishable from the real thing. "Don't listen," Bryce warned. "It's trying to trick us." The voices continued, becoming more desperate, more anguished. Then they changed, melding together into something that wasn't quite human anymore. A guttural, multi-toned howl that raised the hairs on my arms. With a final, tremendous crash, part of the roof gave way. Rain poured in through the gap along with something else, a dark, twisted shape that landed in the far corner with predatory grace. In the dim light, I couldn't make out details, just an impression of wrongness. Limbs too long, movements too fluid, a face that seemed to shift between human and animal features. It rose to its full height, towering over us, and let out a soft, rattling hiss. "Don't look at its eyes," Bryce warned, his voice strained. "Whatever happens, don't look directly at it." The creature took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between us with agonizing slowness. I could smell it now, a rank odor of wet fur, decay, and something else, something chemical and bitter. Bryce began to chant, low and rhythmic, holding his medicine pouch out like a shield. The creature paused, its head tilting at an impossible angle as it considered this new development. For a moment, I thought Bryce's chanting might be working. The creature remained still, watching, listening. Then it lunged, faster than my eye could track, straight toward Ruby. Jasper moved without thinking, shoving her aside and taking the brunt of the attack himself. The creature's claws, or were they hands, closed around his throat, lifting him as if he weighed nothing. "No!" Ruby screamed, grabbing at Jasper's legs as he was dragged toward the hole in the roof. Liam and I rushed forward, trying to help, but the creature was inhumanly strong. It flung Jasper upward through the opening with terrible ease. We heard his scream, abruptly cut short, then silence. Ruby collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. Liam stood frozen, staring at the hole in the roof where Jasper had disappeared. But Bryce hadn't stopped chanting. If anything, his voice grew stronger, more commanding. He stepped forward, still holding the medicine pouch, directly beneath the opening. "What are you doing?" I hissed, trying to pull him back. He shook me off, continuing his chant. Above, something moved across the roof, returning. The creature's face appeared in the opening, inhuman eyes gleaming in the darkness. It stared down at Bryce, who stared back defiantly, still chanting. Then, to my amazement, it withdrew. We heard it moving away across the roof, its footsteps fading until they were indistinguishable from the rain. "Is it gone?" Liam whispered after several minutes had passed without further attack. Bryce finally stopped chanting, his face drained of color. "For now. But it took Jasper. It got what it wanted." Ruby's sobs intensified. "We have to help him. We have to go after him." "There's nothing we can do for him now," Bryce said gently, kneeling beside her. "I'm sorry, Ruby. He's gone." The brutal truth of his words hung in the air. One of us was dead, taken by something that shouldn't exist, something from nightmare. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Bryce looked toward the broken roof, where rain continued to pour in. "We wait for dawn. It's strongest at night. Once it's light, we run, straight for the trailhead, no stopping, no matter what." None of us slept that night. We huddled together in the center of the room, as far from the walls and the hole in the roof as possible. Ruby's sobs eventually subsided into a hollow silence that was somehow worse. Occasionally, we would hear movement outside, soft footfalls circling the station, testing, waiting. But it didn't attack again. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the walls, Bryce stood. "It's time. We need to move now, while it's weakest." "What about Jasper?" Ruby asked, her voice raw. Bryce's expression was gentle but firm. "We can send help back for him once we're safe. But we need to go now, or none of us will make it out." With leaden hearts, we gathered what remained of our supplies and prepared to leave the relative safety of the station. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a forest dripping with moisture, shrouded in morning mist. "Stay close," Bryce instructed as we stepped outside. "Don't get separated no matter what." The trail was barely visible, washed out by the rain in places. We moved as quickly as the treacherous footing would allow, every sense strained for signs of pursuit. "How far to the trailhead?" I asked after we'd been hiking for what felt like hours. Liam checked the GPS. 2 miles, maybe less. We're making good time." Those words had barely left his mouth when we heard it, a long, mournful howl that echoed through the trees. It was distant but moving closer. "It's hunting us again," Bryce said, his face grim. "We need to run, now." We broke into a desperate sprint, abandoning caution in favor of speed. The trail wound downward, increasingly steep and slick with mud. Twice I nearly fell, saved only by Liam's quick reflexes. Behind us, the howling grew closer. Whatever was chasing us was moving faster than any natural animal could, covering ground with impossible speed. "There!" Liam suddenly shouted, pointing ahead. "I can see the parking area." Through the trees, I caught a glimpse of our SUV, still parked where we'd left it a lifetime ago. So close, yet still too far. The creature burst from the underbrush behind us, no longer bothering with stealth. In the daylight, I got my first clear look at it, and immediately wished I hadn't. It ran on all fours, yet its limbs were unmistakably human in shape, though elongated and bent at wrong angles. Its body was covered in what looked like a coyote's pelt, the animal's head serving as a hood that partially concealed a face that was neither fully human nor fully animal. And its eyes, intelligent, aware, filled with ancient malice. "Don't look back," Bryce screamed, seeing me falter. "Just run!" We flew down the final stretch of trail, the creature so close I could hear its ragged breathing. The parking area opened up before us, our vehicle a beacon of safety. Liam reached it first, fumbling with the keys as the rest of us pounded across the clearing. He got the doors unlocked just as we reached him, and we piled in frantically. "Go, go, go!" Ruby screamed as the creature emerged from the tree line. Liam gunned the engine, throwing the SUV into reverse and backing out so quickly we were nearly thrown from our seats. As we spun around to face the forest road, I caught one last glimpse of our pursuer. It stood at the edge of the clearing, watching us with those terrible, knowing eyes. Then it did something that chilled me to my core. It raised one distorted hand in what almost seemed like a farewell, as if it knew this wasn't really an escape, as if it knew we'd be back. We sped down the forest road, no one speaking, the only sound our ragged breathing and Ruby's quiet sobs. Only when we reached the main highway did some of the tension begin to ease. "We need to report this," Liam finally said, breaking the heavy silence. "Jasper, the authorities need to know." Bryce shook his head slowly. "Report what? That a mythical Navajo shapeshifter killed our friend? They'll think we're crazy or worse, that we did something to him ourselves. So we just say nothing?" Ruby's voice was edged with hysteria. "Jasper is dead. We can't just pretend it didn't happen." "We'll tell them he got separated during the storm," Bryce said quietly. "That we searched but couldn't find him. It's close enough to the truth. None of us liked it, but we knew he was right. The full truth would never be believed." As we drove back toward Flagstaff, I couldn't shake the image of the creature standing at the forest's edge, that almost human gesture of farewell. It had let us go, not out of mercy, but because it was patient, because it knew the wilderness would call to us again someday, and when it did, it would be waiting. Some part of me wondered if it already had what it wanted, if in taking Jasper, it had somehow marked the rest of us, connected us to it in ways we didn't yet understand. I glanced at my companions. Liam focused intently on the road, Ruby curled into herself in the back seat, Bryce staring out the window at the passing forest with haunted eyes. We had survived, but we weren't whole. And as the miles between us and Kaibab Lake grew, I couldn't escape the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped at all. That the thing in the woods had followed us out in ways we couldn't see. That it was with us even now, patient and watchful, biding its time, waiting for the wilderness to call us back. The official search for Jasper lasted 3 days. Park rangers, local police, and volunteer search teams combed the area where we claimed to have lost him during the storm. They found nothing, no body, no blood, no sign that he had ever been there at all. "It's like he just vanished," the lead ranger told us on the final day of the search, his weathered face grim, without a trace. We sat in plastic chairs at the ranger station, giving statements for what felt like the 100th time. Our story remained consistent. We'd been separated during the storm, tried to find him, but eventually had to make our way out before nightfall. None of us mentioned the creature, the ranger station, or what we'd really seen. Who would believe us? Ruby was inconsolable. She'd retreated into herself, speaking only when directly addressed, her eyes vacant and red-rimmed. The Australian consulate had been notified, and Jasper's parents were flying in. I couldn't imagine facing them, knowing what we knew. Liam handled the practical aspects, extending our hotel stay, dealing with authorities, arranging for Ruby's eventual return to Australia. He moved through these tasks with mechanical efficiency, as if keeping busy could somehow hold the horror at bay. And Bryce? Bryce had grown increasingly distant, spending hours on the phone with someone he would only identify as an elder from my grandmother's community. When pressed, he would simply say he was looking for answers. I found myself unable to sleep, jerking awake at the slightest sound, convinced that somehow the creature had followed us back to civilization. In the shower, I would examine my skin for marks, bruises, anything that might indicate I'd been claimed in some way. Rationally, I knew this was paranoia, trauma manifesting as superstition. But rationality had little power against what we'd experienced. On the fourth day after our return, as the official search was being called off, Bryce gathered us in his hotel room. "I've been talking to someone who might be able to help us understand what happened," he said, closing the door carefully behind us. "A medicine man from the Navajo Nation. He's agreed to meet with us." "What's the point?" Ruby asked, her voice flat. "Jasper's gone. Understanding why won't bring him back." "It's not just about understanding," Bryce replied, his expression grave. "It's about protection. What happened out there? It may not be over." A cold weight settled in my stomach. "What do you mean?" Bryce hesitated, then sighed. "The elder I've been speaking with, Joseph. He says that skinwalkers sometimes mark their victims, not just the ones they take, but those they let go." "Mark them how?" Liam demanded. "Spiritually, like a connection, a thread that can be followed." Bryce paced the small room. "He thinks that's why it let us escape, because it can find us again whenever it wants." The implication hung heavy in the air. We weren't safe. We might never be safe again. "So what does this medicine man suggest?" I asked, trying to keep the skepticism from my voice. A week ago, I wouldn't have believed in skinwalkers either. Now, I wasn't sure what to believe. "A cleansing ceremony," Bryce said, "something to sever the connection, to hide us from it." Ruby looked up, the first spark of interest in her eyes for days. "Will it work?" "Joseph believes it will," Bryce replied. "But he wants to meet us first to see how strong the connection is." We agreed to meet with the medicine man the following day. What choice did we have? If there was even a chance that something was still connecting us to that thing in the forest, we needed to break it. Joseph Begay lived on the outskirts of the Navajo reservation, in a modest house set back from the road, surrounded by juniper trees. He was older than I'd expected, perhaps in his 70s, with a deeply lined face and eyes that seemed to see more than was visible. He greeted us in his living room, which was sparsely furnished but adorned with traditional Navajo crafts, woven rugs, pottery, and what looked like ceremonial items I couldn't identify. "Bryce has told me of your encounter," Joseph said after we were seated. His voice was soft but carried an undeniable authority. "I am sorry for your loss." Ruby nodded, tears welling in her eyes again. "What happened to our friend?" Liam asked bluntly. "Was it really a skinwalker?" Joseph's expression remained impassive. "There are things in this world that do not fit neatly into modern understanding. The Yi Nald Lushi is one such thing." "But how is that possible?" I pressed. "How can someone transform like that?" The old man regarded me steadily. "The how is not important, only the what and the why. The skinwalker you encountered is ancient, powerful. It has claimed that territory as its own for generations." "The lake," Bryce murmured. "To dich ini. You knew about it?" Joseph nodded. "Many know of it, but few speak of it. To name such things is to draw their attention." "Is Jasper—" Ruby's voice broke. "Is he dead?" A heavy silence fell. Finally, Joseph spoke, his words careful and measured. "Death, as you understand it, may not apply here. The skinwalker takes what it needs: strength, essence. The body is secondary." It wasn't the comfort Ruby was hoping for. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "You said we might be marked," I said, steering the conversation back. "How would we know?" Joseph's gaze swept over each of us in turn, lingering longer on Ruby. "There are signs, dreams of being watched or followed, objects moving on their own, the feeling of someone breathing just behind you when you're alone." A chill ran down my spine. I'd experienced all three since our return. "Can you help us?" Bryce asked. Joseph nodded slowly. "I can perform a cleansing ceremony. It may break the connection, if it exists. But you must understand, the skinwalker's power is greatest over those who fear it, who believe in it, and now all of you believe." "So what, we just need to stop believing?" Liam scoffed. "After what we saw?" "No," Joseph replied calmly. "Belief cannot be undone, but fear can be mastered." He instructed us to return the next evening for the ceremony. In the meantime, he gave each of us a small pouch similar to what Bryce had carried, a medicine bundle, he called it, and told us to keep it with us at all times. As we left Joseph's house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The junipers surrounding the property seemed to bend inward, closing around us like grasping hands. Wind whispered through their branches, carrying what sounded almost like my name. That night, in my hotel room, I dreamed of the forest. I was running along the trail, pursued by something I couldn't see but could feel getting closer with each step. The path stretched endlessly before me, never leading to safety, only deeper into green shadow. Then suddenly I was at the lake, standing on the shore near the cabin. The water's surface was glass smooth, reflecting a sky I couldn't see when I looked up. And in that reflection, standing just behind me, was the skinwalker, half human, half beast, its eyes locked on mine. I tried to run but found my feet rooted to the spot. The creature reached for me with elongated fingers, its touch cold as it gripped my shoulder. "You are mine now," it whispered in Jasper's voice. "You will come back to me." I woke with a strangled cry, drenched in sweat despite the room's air conditioning. My shoulder ached where the creature had touched me in the dream, a dull, persistent pain that felt too real to dismiss. When I checked the mirror, there was no mark, no bruise. But the pain remained. I called Bryce immediately, not caring that it was 3 a.m. "I had a dream," I said when he answered, my voice shaking. "It spoke to me." There was a long pause. "What did it say?" "That I would go back, that I was marked." Another pause, longer this time. "Ruby called an hour ago, same dream." The next day passed in a fog of anxiety and exhaustion. None of us had slept well, all haunted by similar dreams. By the time we returned to Joseph's house for the ceremony, we were strung tight with fear and desperate for any relief he could offer. Joseph had prepared a small hogan, a traditional Navajo dwelling, behind his house for the ceremony. Inside, a fire burned in a central pit, the smoke escaping through a hole in the roof. Various herbs and powders were arranged nearby, alongside ceremonial items I didn't recognize. "Remove your shoes and sit," Joseph instructed, gesturing to spaces around the fire. "The ceremony will take several hours. You must remain focused, no matter what you see or hear." We did as he directed, forming a circle around the flames. Joseph began to chant in Navajo, occasionally adding herbs to the fire that filled the hogan with pungent, aromatic smoke. The language was beautiful but alien to my ears, rising and falling in complex patterns. As the ceremony progressed, Joseph used an eagle feather to fan the smoke toward each of us in turn, instructing us to breathe deeply. The smoke made my head swim, my vision blurring at the edges. Was it my imagination, or were there shapes moving in the darkness beyond the fire's light? Shadows that shouldn't be there, watching us with patient malice. Joseph's chanting intensified. He took a small container of what looked like white ash and drew symbols on our foreheads, all the while speaking in Navajo. The ash felt cool against my skin, grounding me somehow against the disorientation of the smoke. Time lost meaning in that small, smoky space. It could have been minutes or hours that we sat there, breathing the herb-laden air, listening to Joseph's voice rise and fall. At some point, I closed my eyes, letting the rhythm of the chanting wash over me. Behind my closed lids, I saw the forest again, but different this time. Clearer, as if seen in bright daylight rather than shadow. I was walking a path I recognized, leading to the lake, but there was no fear in me. Each step felt purposeful, directed. I reached the shore and looked out over the water, which reflected a perfect blue sky. And there, on the opposite shore, stood a figure. Not the twisted, half-human shape of the skinwalker, but a man, tall and straight, dressed in what looked like traditional Navajo clothing. He raised a hand in greeting, then pointed to something beside me. I looked down to see a small stone, perfectly round and smooth, half buried in the sand at my feet. "Take it," the man called, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "It will guide you back when the time comes." I bent to pick up the stone, which felt warm in my palm, almost alive. When I looked up again, the man was gone, and the dream began to fade. I opened my eyes to find the ceremony ending. Joseph was sitting back on his heels, exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to see the faces of my companions. They looked as dazed as I felt, blinking slowly as if waking from a deep sleep. "It is done," Joseph said simply. "Did it work?" Ruby asked, her voice hoarse. "Are we free of it?" Joseph's expression was enigmatic. "The connection has been altered but not broken. Such things cannot be fully undone once established." "What does that mean?" Liam demanded. "Are we still in danger?" "The Skinwalker's hold on you has been weakened," Joseph explained. "It will be more difficult for it to find you, to influence you, but not impossible." "So what do we do?" I asked, frustration edging my voice. "Just live in fear for the rest of our lives?" Joseph regarded me thoughtfully. "Fear is what it feeds on, what gives it power over you. Master your fear, and you master the Skinwalker." Easy to say, not so easy to do. As we prepared to leave, Joseph pulled me aside. "Your vision during the ceremony," he said quietly. "What did you see?" I hesitated, then described the dream, the lake, the man, the stone. Joseph listened intently, his weathered face giving nothing away. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "The man was a guide," he said, "a protector, and the stone—" He paused, considering his words carefully. "The stone is a way back." "Back where?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. "To the lake, to finish what was started." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "I don't want to go back there, ever." Joseph's eyes were sympathetic but unyielding. "Some paths cannot be abandoned once we start down them. The Skinwalker has marked you differently from the others. It has chosen you." "For what?" "That," he said, "you will have to discover for yourself." We left Joseph's house with more questions than answers, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The cleansing ceremony had provided some relief. The immediate sense of being watched had diminished. But his words left a lingering unease, especially for me. Chosen. The word echoed in my mind, carrying implications I didn't want to consider. That night, for the first time since our return, I slept without dreams of the forest. But when I woke, I found my hand closed tightly around something that hadn't been there when I went to sleep. A small, smooth stone, warm to the touch, exactly like the one from my vision. A way back, Joseph had called it. I stared at the stone, turning it over in my palm. How had it gotten here? Was it even real, or was I losing my grip on reality? A text from Bryce interrupted my spiraling thoughts. "Need to talk. Meet at breakfast?" In the hotel restaurant, I found not just Bryce, but Liam and Ruby as well, huddled together over coffee cups. Their expressions told me something was wrong, even before they spoke. "Ruby's going back to Australia this afternoon," Liam explained as I sat down. "The consulate arranged it." Ruby looked marginally better than she had in days, still pale and drawn, but with a new determination in her eyes. "I need to talk to Jasper's parents," she said. "They deserve to know what happened to their son. The truth, not the story we told the Rangers." "They won't believe you," Bryce warned gently. "Maybe not," she conceded. "But I have to try." I understood her need for closure, for some kind of resolution, even if it came at the cost of being thought delusional. But there was something else in her expression. A finality that suggested more than just a return home. "What about you two?" I asked Liam and Bryce. Liam shrugged. "Back to Toronto for me. I've already extended my trip longer than I planned." "And I'm heading back to my grandmother's community," Bryce said. "There are elders there who might know more about what we encountered, about how to protect ourselves long term." They were all leaving, moving on or trying to, and I would be left alone with my questions, my stone, and the unsettling knowledge that I had been chosen for something I didn't understand. "Did either of you have any strange experiences last night?" I asked cautiously. "After the ceremony?" They exchanged glances, then shook their heads. Whatever had happened with the stone was unique to me. I debated telling them, sharing the burden of this new mystery, but what good would it do? They were already traumatized, already struggling to make sense of what had happened. Adding my own bizarre experience would only make things worse. So I kept silent, forcing a smile as we discussed practical matters. Contact information, promises to stay in touch, hollow reassurances that things would get better with time. Later that day, we said our goodbyes at the airport. Ruby was the first to leave, her flight to Los Angeles connecting to Sydney. She hugged each of us fiercely, her tears dampening my shirt. "Be careful," she whispered in my ear. "It's not over. I can feel it." Liam's departure was next, more restrained but no less emotional. He gripped my shoulder, his expression solemn. "Whatever happens," he said, "remember we survived once. We can do it again if we have to." Bryce was the last to go, his flight to Albuquerque departing an hour after Liam's. As we waited at his gate, he pulled something from his pocket, another medicine bundle, larger than the one Joseph had given me. "Take this," he said, pressing it into my hand. "Joseph made it specially for you. Said you might need extra protection." I stared at the small leather pouch, a sense of foreboding washing over me. "Did he tell you why?" Bryce hesitated, then nodded. "He said you were different, that the skinwalker had marked you not just to follow, but to call back." "Call me back where?" "To the lake," Bryce replied, confirming what I already feared. "He thinks the skinwalker wants you to return for some purpose we don't understand." I closed my fingers around the medicine bundle, feeling the small objects inside shift against each other. "And if I don't go back?" Bryce's expression was grim. "Then it might come to you instead." With those ominous words hanging between us, we said our goodbyes. I watched him board his flight, suddenly feeling very alone despite the crowded terminal surrounding me. Outside, the Arizona sun beat down mercilessly, the heat a stark contrast to the cold dread spreading through me. I had a decision to make, one that might determine not just my fate, but possibly those of my friends as well. Return to the lake and face whatever awaited me there, or spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for the skinwalker to find me. In my pocket, the mysterious stone seemed to pulse with warmth, as if responding to my thoughts. A way back, Joseph had called it. Perhaps it was also the way forward, the only way to end this nightmare for good. With a deep breath, I pulled out my phone and opened the rental car app. The forest was calling me back, and this time, I would go alone. The drive back to the trailhead felt like moving through a dream, or more accurately, a nightmare I was willingly re-entering. I told no one of my plans, leaving a deliberately vague message on Bryce's voicemail that I was taking care of things before heading home. Part of me recognized the insanity of what I was doing. Returning alone to the place where we'd been hunted, where Jasper had been taken, armed with nothing but a medicine bundle and a mysterious stone that had appeared in my hand while I slept. If I told anyone, they would have tried to stop me, or worse, insisted on coming along, putting themselves in danger again. No, this was my burden now. Whatever connection existed between me and the skinwalker, I had to face it alone. The forest road was just as I remembered it, rutted and isolated, winding through increasingly dense pines. When I reached the small clearing that served as a parking area, I sat for a long moment with the engine idling, gathering my courage. What exactly was I planning to do? Hike back to the lake, alone, and then what? Confront an ancient evil? Negotiate with it? The absurdity of my position wasn't lost on me. But the alternative, living in fear, always looking over my shoulder, dreaming of the forest every night, was unacceptable. I turned off the engine and sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the wilderness around me, wind in the pines, distant bird calls, nothing sinister, nothing threatening, just nature, indifferent to human fears. Finally, I stepped out of the car. The forest air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and earth. I slung my backpack packed with water, energy bars, a first aid kit, and a small tent over my shoulders, checked that both medicine bundles were secure in my pocket, and set off down the trail. Unlike our first journey, I moved slowly, deliberately. There was no need to reach the lake before nightfall. In fact, part of me suspected that darkness was when the skinwalker would be most likely to reveal itself. The trail was easier to follow than I remembered, despite the damage from the storm. Recent footprints in the mud told me the search teams had been thorough in their efforts to find Jasper. But they'd been looking in the wrong places, for the wrong things. As I hiked, I found myself noticing details I'd missed before, the complex patterns of lichen on rocks, the varied birdsong echoing through the canopy, the way sunlight filtered through pine needles to create dappled patterns on the forest floor. The wilderness was beautiful in its own right, when not viewed through a lens of fear. I reached the first clearing, where we'd camped that first night, by early afternoon. It looked different in daylight, smaller and less mysterious. Evidence of our stay had been mostly washed away by the storm, but I found a single tent stake we'd overlooked, half buried in mud. I continued on, the trail gradually becoming steeper, more challenging. My muscles burned with the effort, but the physical exertion helped keep darker thoughts at bay. Focus on the next step, the next breath. The forest demanded nothing less. By late afternoon, I came upon the stone circle that had so disturbed Bryce on our first journey. It looked harmless now, just rocks arranged in a pattern that could have been the work of hikers or children. But something about it still made me uneasy. I stepped off the trail to give it a wide berth, just as we had before. As the day waned, the forest grew quieter, the bird calls tapering off, the wind dying down to occasional whispers through the canopy. The quality of the light changed, golden late-afternoon sun giving way to the blue-gray of approaching dusk. I should have been afraid as darkness approached, but strangely I felt almost calm. Whatever was going to happen would happen. I had come too far to turn back now. The lake appeared just as the last direct sunlight was fading from the sky, a sheet of silver nestled in its bowl of pine-covered hills. The cabin was visible on the far shore, looking smaller and more decrepit than I remembered. I paused at the lake's edge, letting my backpack slip to the ground. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the darkening sky and the silhouettes of surrounding trees. No wind disturbed its surface, no fish jumped, no birds skimmed low over the water. The silence was absolute. "I'm here," I said aloud, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "I came back." No response, just the endless silence and the growing darkness. I retrieved my backpack and began moving along the shoreline toward the cabin. It seemed the logical place to wait, shelter for the night, and a connection to what had happened before. The medicine bundle from Joseph felt warm against my skin through my pocket. The stone, too, seemed to radiate a subtle heat, as if responding to the proximity of the lake. I took it out and examined it in the fading light, perfectly round, smooth as glass, with swirls of darker color running through its grayish surface. I'd nearly reached the cabin when I noticed something odd about the lake. The water near the shore was moving, despite the lack of wind, small ripples spreading outward from a central point about 20 feet from where I stood. As I watched, the ripples grew stronger, more deliberate, as if something large was rising from the depths. Water bulged upward and then parted to reveal Jasper. He stood waist-deep in the lake, water streaming from his clothes, his hair plastered to his skull. But his eyes were wrong, reflecting the dim light like an animal's. "Hello," he said, and though it was Jasper's voice, there was something underneath it, a second voice, lower and older. "You came back." I took an involuntary step backward. "You're not Jasper." The thing wearing my friend's face smiled, the expression too wide, too full of teeth. "No, but his form serves my purpose." "What purpose?" I managed to ask, my mouth dry with fear. The creature moved closer, water rippling around it as it waded toward shore. "To speak with you, to finish what was started." I clutched the medicine bundle in my pocket, drawing what courage I could from its presence. "What do you want from me? Why did you mark me?" The thing that wasn't Jasper reached the shoreline and stepped onto dry land. Water ran from its clothes, but instead of soaking into the earth, it seemed to be absorbed back into the creature's body, leaving no trace. "You were already marked," it said, tilting its head at an unnatural angle. "From before you ever came to this place, I merely recognized what was already there." It took another step toward me, and I fought the urge to flee. Running had done no good before. It would do no good now. "What do you mean, already marked?" I demanded. The creature's eyes, Jasper's eyes, but not, regarded me with ancient patience. "Some humans are born with a foot in two worlds. You see beyond the veil that blinds most of your kind. It makes you valuable." "Valuable for what?" Instead of answering, it gestured toward the stone I still held in my open palm. "The old one gave you that. Joseph. He understands more than most." What is it? A talisman. A key. It depends on how you use it. The creature took another step forward, now close enough that I could see the subtle wrongness of its movements, too fluid in some places, too stiff in others, as if it hadn't quite mastered the mechanics of Jasper's body. The Skinwalker, I said, forcing myself to name it. That's what you are. A ripple seemed to pass through Jasper's features, momentarily revealing something else beneath, something older, wilder. That is what the Dene call me. I am older than their name, older than their stories. You took Jasper. You killed him. The creature shook its head, an oddly human gesture. Not killed, transformed. His essence serves a greater purpose now. Anger flared through my fear. He had a life, people who loved him. You had no right. Rights? The creature interrupted, and now there was an edge to its voice. You speak of rights while your kind destroys this forest, this world? I have survived here for centuries because I take only what I need when I need it. And what do you need me for? I asked, the key question finally emerging. The creature's expression softened into something almost like pity. To bear witness, to remember, to carry the truth back to your world. What truth? That the old ways are not dead. That the spaces between your world and others grow thin. That what you call myths have teeth and claws and memories. It moved closer still until we were face to face. I could smell the lake water on it, mixed with something else. A wild animal scent that made the hairs on my arms stand up. You stand at a threshold, it continued. You always have. Now you must choose which side you will walk on. I clutched the stone tighter, feeling its warmth intensify. And if I refuse to choose? The creature smiled again, Jasper's face distorting with the expression. Then you will remain caught between, never belonging to either world. The dreams will continue. The calling will grow stronger. Eventually, you will return to this place again and again until you make your choice. A choice. It always came down to a choice. I looked past the creature, to the lake now dark with night, to the cabin standing silent on its shore. This place that had brought such terror, such loss, and yet also a kind of awakening to realities I had never acknowledged before, to aspects of myself I had never recognized. What happens if I choose? I asked, my voice steady despite my racing heart. If you choose the human world, I will release my mark upon you. You will return to your life, free of the dreams, the calling. You will forget in time. And the other choice? The creature's eyes gleamed in the gathering darkness. You stay. You learn. You become more than what you are. Become like you? I couldn't keep the revulsion from my voice. No, it replied, not like me. I was made, not born. You would be something else. A bridge, perhaps, between worlds that have grown too far apart. I thought of my life before. Ordinary, predictable, safe. And I thought of what I had experienced here. Terror, yes, but also wonder. A glimpse behind the veil of reality to something older, wilder, more primal. The stone in my hand seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat now, growing warmer, more insistent. How do I choose? I finally asked. The creature extended its hand, Jasper's hand, but somehow longer, the fingers more articulated. Give me the stone, and you choose the human world. Keep it, and you choose the other. Such a simple gesture to determine the course of a life. I stared at the outstretched hand, then at the stone gleaming dully in my palm. Which world did I belong to? The one I had always known, or the one I had only glimpsed? In that moment of decision, time seemed to stretch. I saw possible futures branching before me, returning to my old life, trying to forget what I had seen, what I had learned, or staying, embracing the unknown, walking a path few humans had traveled. The stone felt alive now, almost vibrating with potential. I closed my fingers around it, feeling its warmth spread up my arm and through my body. I keep it, I said quietly. The creature, the skinwalker, nodded slowly, as if it had expected no other answer. The threshold is crossed. There is no returning. As it spoke, the world around me seemed to shift, the forest becoming more vivid, more present. Sounds I hadn't noticed before reached my ears. The subtle movement of small creatures in the underbrush, the faint lapping of water against the shore, the whisper of wind through pine needles that had been still moments before. "What happens now?" I asked, suddenly uncertain despite my decision. "Now," the skinwalker said, its form already beginning to change. Jasper's features melting away to reveal something older, something wild. "You learn, you witness, you remember." It turned toward the forest, its transformation accelerating, limbs elongating, body twisting, until what stood before me was the creature I had glimpsed during the storm. Not human, not animal, but something in between, ancient and powerful. "Come," it said, its voice now a multi-toned growl that I understood nonetheless. "The forest awaits." As I followed the skinwalker into the trees, leaving the lake behind, I felt a strange peace settle over me. Fear remained. Yes, only a fool would feel no fear in the presence of such a being. But it was tempered by curiosity, by wonder, by the certainty that I had chosen the right path, however strange and dangerous it might prove. The stone in my hand had cooled now, its purpose fulfilled. I slipped it into my pocket alongside the medicine bundles, tokens of a threshold crossed, a decision made. Behind us, the lake gleamed silver in the moonlight, a mirror reflecting stars and ancient pines. Kaibab Lake. Todicini, the bitter water. It had claimed one of us. It had transformed another. And those who had escaped would carry its mark forever, whether they acknowledged it or not. The wilderness holds many secrets, many truths. Some beautiful, some terrible. All powerful in their own way. To witness them is to be changed. To embrace them is to be reborn. As we moved deeper into the forest, leaving all traces of the human world behind, I understood that my journey was just beginning. That the true mystery, the mystery of what lies between worlds, of what watches from the shadows, of what calls to us in dreams, was only now beginning to unfold. The skinwalker moved ahead of me, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4, a shadow among shadows, leading me toward whatever destiny awaited. I followed, walking a path few had tread before, into the heart of the wild, into the spaces between worlds, into truth. I never intended to become a park ranger at Whispering Pines National Forest. The job found me during the lowest point of my life, when I was desperate for escape and solitude. My name is River Winding, a name chosen by my grandmother who claimed our distant ancestors walked these same forests centuries ago. Whether that's true or just family mythology, I felt a strange pull to these woods my entire life. The ranger station, my new home, sat on the shore of Obsidian Lake, a dark mirror surrounded by towering pines and ancient cedars. The cabin itself was rustic but sturdy, built in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps with logs that had weathered decades of storms. Inside, the worn wooden floors creaked with every step, and the stone fireplace dominated the main room. The isolation was precisely what I needed after 3 years working a soul-crushing corporate job in Seattle. "Most folks don't last more than a season out here," Supervisor Morrison told me during my orientation, his weathered face serious beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "The isolation gets to them. The silence starts to feel heavy." I nodded, thinking he was being dramatic. Now, 4 months into my post, I understood exactly what he meant. The job description seemed straightforward. Monitor wildlife activity, maintain trails, assist lost hikers, and report any unusual activities. What the manual didn't mention were the unexplained sounds that echoed through the valley at night, sounds that didn't match any known wildlife. My first encounter with something unusual happened during my 3rd week. I was marking a new trail section when I noticed a massive impression in the soft earth near Boulder Creek. At first glance, it resembled a large bear track, but the proportions were wrong. Too large, with 5 distinct toe impressions splayed wider than any bear I'd documented. I photographed it, took measurements, and reported it to headquarters as an unidentified large mammal track. The response came 2 days later. Probable bear track distorted by rain. Continue monitoring. But it hadn't rained in weeks. I began keeping a private journal of the strange occurrences, Broken trees, not cut or gnawed, but snapped 8 feet up the trunk with immense force. Clumps of dark, coarse hair caught on bark that didn't match any cataloged species in our database. And the sounds, deep, rumbling vocalizations that carried across the lake on still nights, making the windows of my cabin vibrate. My radio crackled to life one evening as I sat on my porch watching the sun sink behind the mountains. "River, we've got 2 hikers overdue at checkpoint 4. Last contact was yesterday afternoon near Eagle Ridge. Over." I grabbed my gear and headed out. Night searches were always the most dangerous, but also when people needed help most desperately. As my flashlight beam cut through the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed to breathe around me, alive with tension. I found the hikers 3 miles off trail, huddled against a rock formation. A young couple from Portland who had veered off the marked path to photograph a rare orchid. The woman, pale with fear, gripped my arm as they explained what had driven them to hide. "We heard something following us," she whispered. Heavy footsteps, breaking branches. Then we saw it, just for a second between the trees. It was huge, walking upright. We thought it was another hiker at first, but her partner finished her thought. It was too big. No human moves like that. I led them back to safety, attributing their experience to a black bear, though I knew black bears rarely walk upright for extended periods. Back at my cabin, I added their account to my growing journal, alongside a map marking all incident locations. A pattern was emerging, a territory, centered around the densest, oldest section of the forest where the ranger paths ended and true wilderness began. That night I woke to the sound of heavy footsteps on my porch. The wooden boards creaked under significant weight. I reached for my rifle, heart pounding against my ribs. Something large scraped against the door, not knocking, but seeming to measure it, testing its strength. The handle rattled. I held my breath, finger hovering near the trigger. Then came a smell seeping through the cabin, musky, wild, and utterly foreign. The footsteps retreated, but I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I found massive tracks in the soft earth around my cabin and deep scratches in the door's wooden frame, at least 8 feet high. Whatever was out there, it knew where I lived, and it was getting curious. Chapter 2. Whispers Across Borders. "You're seeing something territorial, mate. Happens in the outback all the time." Jackson Kearns, my Australian friend from ranger training, spoke with confidence over our monthly video call. His outpost in the Northern Territory dealt with some of the world's deadliest creatures, yet none of my descriptions seemed to rattle him. "Not like this," I insisted, adjusting my laptop so he could see the plaster cast I'd made of the footprint outside my cabin. "This is nearly 18 inches long. What leaves tracks like this?" Jackson leaned closer to his camera, his sunburned face growing serious. "Nothing I've encountered. You sent it to the wildlife department?" 3 weeks ago. Still waiting for a response." I didn't mention how headquarters had become increasingly dismissive of my reports, suggesting I was suffering from isolation-induced paranoia. My other long-distance confidant, Madeleine Beaufort from Quebec's Boreal Forest Service, had a different perspective when I called her later that evening. "The First Nations people here have stories," she said, her French-Canadian accent thickening as she lowered her voice, "of creatures that live between worlds. Not quite animal, not quite human. The elders say they've always been there, watching from the boundary places. You think that's what I'm dealing with? Folklore?" I couldn't keep the frustration from my voice. "I think," she replied carefully, "that indigenous stories often contain warnings based on real environmental dangers. Perhaps what you're encountering has been there all along, and people have simply given it different names through history." The conversation stayed with me as I patrolled the eastern ridge the following day. The forest was unusually quiet. No birdsong, no skittering of small mammals. Just heavy silence pressing in from all sides. Experienced rangers know this silence often precedes predator activity. Near Blackwater Ravine, I discovered a scene that stopped me cold. A bull elk, or what remained of one, lay scattered across a clearing. This wasn't the work of wolves or mountain lions. The carcass hadn't been consumed, it had been torn apart, as if in rage. Some pieces were wedged into the branches of surrounding trees, 15 feet off the ground. As I documented the sight, a branch snapped deep in the forest behind me, then another, closer, deliberate. Whatever moved through the underbrush was large enough to make the earth tremble slightly beneath my boots. I raised my rifle and backed toward the trail, scanning the tree line. A shadow moved between two ancient pines, massive, bipedal, and fast despite its size. I caught only a glimpse before it disappeared deeper into the forest, but that glimpse was enough to accelerate my pulse to a hammering rhythm. Back at the ranger station, I found unexpected company. Ben Miller, a senior ranger from Olympic National Park, sat waiting on my porch. His expression was grim beneath his salt and pepper beard. "Headquarters is concerned about your reports," he said without preamble. "They sent me to evaluate the situation." I invited him inside and laid out my evidence: the journal, photographs, plaster casts, and map of incidents. He examined them without comment, his expression unreadable. "You know what people will say this is," he finally spoke, tapping the footprint cast. "I know what it looks like," I admitted, "but I need to know what it actually is." Ben sighed heavily, suddenly looking older than his 50-something years. "There's a reason I requested this assignment when your reports came across my desk. 23 years ago, I was stationed in the North Cascades, had experiences similar to yours." My mouth went dry. "What did you do?" "Nothing," he said, shame evident in his voice. "Stopped reporting, started carrying extra ammunition, requested a transfer 6 months later." He met my eyes directly. "The department doesn't want documentation of something they can't explain or control. That's why your reports are being buried." That night, as Ben slept in the spare room, I sat by the window watching the tree line. The moon cast long shadows across the clearing between my cabin and the forest edge. In one of those shadows, something moved, something that didn't match the swaying rhythm of the trees. I woke Ben, and together we watched as a massive silhouette emerged partially from the forest. Even at this distance, we could see it stood at least 8 feet tall, with extraordinarily broad shoulders and long arms. It remained at the boundary between forest and clearing, as if respecting some invisible line. "It's watching us," Ben whispered, evaluating. For nearly 20 minutes, the figure remained motionless. Then, with deliberate slowness, it reached up and broke a branch from a nearby pine, a branch thicker than my arm, and placed it on the ground at the forest's edge, pointing toward my cabin. "Is it leaving a message?" I asked. Ben's face had gone pale. "It's leaving a warning." The figure retreated into the darkness, but its presence lingered like a physical weight against my chest. That night, the sounds from the forest changed. No longer distant calls, but closer vocalizations that almost resembled words. "Tomorrow," Ben said as dawn broke after our sleepless night, "we need to check the historical records. If this thing has been here for generations, someone must have documented it, officially or not." We spent the day in the station's archives, digging through yellowed reports dating back to the park's founding. Most contained mundane observations, but in a file from 1937, we found a handwritten account from Ranger Joseph Blackwell that made my skin prickle. The thing continues its surveillance of the station, larger than any man, covered in dark fur. The missing hiker's belongings were found arranged in a semicircle at the forest boundary. Warning or offering, I cannot determine. Indian guides refuse to enter the northern valley, calling it the place where shadows walk upright. I have requested transfer. The file contained one photograph, blurry, taken from distance, showing a dark, tall figure at the forest edge, the same spot where we had seen our visitor the night before. "They've always known," Ben said quietly. "Every administration, every generation of rangers. They just decided it was better to pretend it wasn't real." That evening, as we discussed our next steps, the radio crackled with an emergency. 3 hikers missing near the northern ridge. The same territory where most sightings had occurred. As we gathered our search gear, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being drawn deliberately into the creature's domain. The search for the missing hikers began at twilight, the worst possible time to enter the forest. Shadows stretched and merged, creating illusions of movement at the periphery of our vision. Ben and I maintained radio contact with headquarters, though we both suspected our real findings would never make it into the official report. "The northern ridge borders what indigenous maps labeled as forbidden territory," Ben explained as we hiked. "The original park boundaries specifically excluded it, but it was incorporated during the expansion of 72. Some of the survey team reportedly quit rather than map that section. Heavy clouds obscured the moon, plunging the forest into near-total darkness. Our flashlights carved narrow tunnels of visibility, beyond which anything could be moving undetected. "Listen," I whispered, raising my hand. The forest had fallen silent again, that preternatural quiet that signals the presence of an apex predator. Even the insects had ceased their chorus. Through that silence came a sound that raised the hair on my neck. Rhythmic footfalls, too heavy for any recognized wildlife, circling our position at a distance of perhaps 50 yards. "It's herding us," Ben muttered, checking his rifle. The footsteps stopped. Then came a sound I'll never forget. A deep, rumbling vocalization that seemed to contain distinct phonetic patterns, not animal growls or calls, but something unsettlingly close to language. Before we could react, a scream pierced the darkness ahead. Human, terrified, and abruptly cut short. We ran toward it, branches whipping our faces as we navigated by flashlight. Breaking into a small clearing, we found a backpack torn open, its contents scattered. Blood darkened the fallen leaves nearby. "Over here!" Ben called, his flashlight illuminating a trail of disturbed earth and broken vegetation leading deeper into the forest. Someone was dragged. We followed the trail for nearly a mile, the signs of struggle gradually diminishing until we reached another clearing. In its center stood a crude structure, not quite a shelter, but a deliberate arrangement of broken tree trunks leaning together to form a rough dome. Inside, huddled together, we found two young women. Their clothes were torn, faces scratched from branches, eyes wide with shock. Of the third hiker, there was no sign. "It took Scott," one of them sobbed as we helped them to their feet. "It came out of nowhere, massive, moving so fast. Scott pushed us away and it grabbed him. We ran, but it caught up, brought us here, and just left us." "Did you see where it went?" I asked, scanning the tree line. "It's still here," the other woman whispered, pointing to the dense forest beyond the clearing. "Watching us. It never leaves." As if in confirmation, a branch snapped in the darkness, then another, closer, a strategy of intimidation, letting us know we were surrounded. "We need to move," Ben said, voice tight. "Now." We formed a tight group, hikers in the center, and began the trek back toward the ranger station. The presence followed, sometimes dropping back, sometimes moving parallel to our path, but never fully retreating. Occasionally, rocks or branches would land near our feet, not hitting us, but demonstrating accuracy that could have been deadly if intended. 2 miles from safety, we found Scott. Or rather, he found us, stumbling from between the trees, dazed, but remarkably unharmed. His account was fragmented, confused. "It could have killed me easily," he kept repeating, "but it just examined me, smelled me, then pushed me away and made this sound like it was trying to speak." As we approached the boundary of the deeper forest, the stalking presence grew more agitated, vocalizations increased in volume and complexity. Heavy footfalls circled faster, branches breaking in quick succession from different directions, a final display of territorial dominance. Then, at the exact spot where the oldest trees gave way to younger growth, the pursuit stopped. Standing at the forest boundary, looking back into the darkness, I could feel eyes watching our retreat. We had been allowed to leave, this time. Back at the ranger station, as paramedics examined the hikers, I pulled Ben aside. "This wasn't a random encounter," I said. "Those hikers were taken into its territory but left alive in that structure. It wanted us to find them." Ben nodded grimly. "It's establishing communication, demonstrating power, territory, and a capacity for restraint. That's not animal behavior. That's negotiation." That night, after filing heavily sanitized reports that mentioned nothing of our bipedal pursuer, Ben revealed what he'd been holding back. "There's a pattern to these incidents across all northwestern parks," he said, spreading a map across my table. Red pins marked locations of similar encounters dating back decades. They're becoming more frequent, more deliberate. As human development pushes deeper into remote areas, these interactions escalate. "You think they're being forced into conflict?" "I think," Ben said carefully, "that something has lived in these forests far longer than we have, and it's finally deciding to enforce its boundaries." Outside, The wind carried vocalizations from across the lake, complex, patterned sounds unlike any known animal call. They continued until dawn, like a message repeated until understood. In the morning, we found another sign. The carcass of a deer placed precisely at the clearing's edge, facing the cabin. Not mutilated or fed upon, presented like an offering, or a warning of capabilities. "What do we do now?" I asked as we stood looking at this grim demonstration. Ben's eyes remained fixed on the dark line of trees beyond. "We acknowledge what we're dealing with. This isn't just a territorial animal. This is something that understands boundaries, demonstrates reasoning, and is attempting communication." He turned to me, expression grave. "The question isn't what we do, it's what it wants." The radio crackled with a new assignment. Another missing hiker, deep in the northern section. As we gathered our gear, a certainty settled over me. We were being drawn back deliberately, pulled deeper into an ancient conflict between worlds that shared the same forests, but had managed to avoid direct confrontation until now. That barrier was eroding, and I was standing directly on the boundary line. The weather turned against us as we set out to find the latest missing hiker, a solo backpacker who'd ventured off-trail despite explicit warnings. Dark clouds rolled in from the mountains, bringing sheets of cold rain that reduced visibility to mere feet. Perfect conditions for something that knew the forest to move undetected. "Stay close," Ben advised as we pushed deeper into restricted territory. "Weather report says this storm's getting worse." The undergrowth grew denser here, undisturbed by trail maintenance or human passage. Ancient trees towered overhead, their massive trunks covered in thick moss. The forest floor was a maze of exposed roots and fallen giants slowly returning to the earth. Every direction looked identical, a disorienting sea of green and brown. 3 hours into our search, the radio signal died. No static, no interference, just complete silence. We were cut off, alone in the oldest section of the wilderness. "This doesn't feel like a coincidence," I said, trying my backup radio with the same result. Ben checked his GPS unit, then tapped it against his palm with a grimace. "Dead too. Something's interfering with the electronics." A crack of thunder directly overhead startled us both. The storm was intensifying, transforming day into premature night. We took shelter under a rocky overhang as the rain turned to hail, pelting the forest floor with marble-sized ice. That's when we noticed them. Tree structures unlike anything in the Ranger Handbook. Throughout the visible forest, massive branches had been woven between standing trees, creating distinct patterns too regular for natural formation. Some resembled crude ladders reaching into the canopy. Others formed circular arrangements around particularly massive trees. All were clearly deliberate. "Tool use," Ben whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Complex environmental modification." Through the curtain of rain, movement caught my eye. A dark figure navigating between trees with surprising grace despite its size. It paused, seemingly aware of our observation, then deliberately broke a branch thicker than my thigh with minimal effort before continuing out of sight. Another demonstration of capability. As the storm briefly lessened, we resumed our search, now following these strange structures rather than any conventional trail. They led deeper into the valley, toward a section marked on the oldest maps as simply unmapped, survey incomplete. Near a stream crossing, we found the first sign of our missing hiker, a trekking pole abandoned on wet stones. Further ahead, a shredded backpack hung from a branch, its contents carefully arranged beneath it, food items separated from tools, electronic devices placed apart from clothing. Not the chaotic scatter of wildlife scavenging, but deliberate categorization. "It's learning about us," Ben observed. "Studying what we carry, how we organize ourselves." The formations of woven branches grew more complex as we advanced, some creating corridors that channeled movement in specific directions. We were being guided, I realized with growing unease, herded along a predetermined path. That path led to a massive clearing unlike anything I'd ever encountered in the national forest. At its center stood what I can only describe as a village of sorts, structures built from interwoven branches, some reaching 30 feet high. Smaller domes surrounded larger central constructions. Pathways had been worn into the earth between them. Most disturbing were the collections of items clearly taken from hikers over decades, Watches, cameras, fragments of clothing, all arranged in precise groupings. My God, Ben breathed. They've been here all along, building, watching. Movement within the structures froze us in place. Not just one creature, but many, at least 7 massive bipedal figures emerging from the largest central dome. They moved with purpose, some standing upright at nearly 9 feet tall, others adopting a hunched posture that still kept them well above human height. Dark fur covered their bodies, faces set with deep-set eyes that reflected intelligence and wariness in equal measure. Among them, looking impossibly small by comparison, stood our missing hiker, unharmed but clearly in shock. The creatures had positioned themselves in a semicircle around him, not threatening, but containing. "We need to approach slowly," Ben whispered. "No sudden movements." As we stepped into the clearing, all activity ceased. The creatures turned as one to observe us, communicating among themselves with those complex vocalizations I'd been hearing for months. One, larger than the others with silver-streaked fur, moved forward deliberately. The silverback placed itself between us and the hiker, then did something I still struggle to comprehend. It mimicked human speech. Not fluently, but recognizably. Rough approximations of words it must have heard from hikers or rangers. "Go, back." The sounds were guttural, forced through vocal anatomy not designed for human language, but unmistakable in intent. Ben and I exchanged stunned glances. Decades of folklore, blurry photographs, and dismissed reports crystallized into the undeniable reality before us. These weren't animals. They represented something else entirely, an intelligence that had evolved parallel to our own, adapting to avoid detection, learning our weaknesses and strengths through careful observation. "We've come for him," Ben said slowly, gesturing to the hiker. "We mean no harm." The silverback studied us, head tilting in consideration. Then it pointed deliberately toward the boundary of their settlement, then to the sky, then drew a line across its throat. The message seemed clear. "Leave before dark." It repeated the rough approximation. "Go, back, all." I realized with sudden clarity that all didn't just mean us in this moment. It meant all humans. The increased encounters, the territorial displays, the warnings left at boundaries, they were responses to encroachment. The park expansion, new trails, increased tourism, we had been pushing into their territory for decades. Now they were pushing back. The silverback approached the hiker and nudged him firmly toward us. The man stumbled forward, wild-eyed but uninjured. "They could have killed me," he stammered as we steadied him. "They just studied me, took my things apart and put them back together, tried to communicate." As we backed slowly from the clearing, the creatures remained motionless, watching. Only when we reached the tree line did they return to their activities, though one remained observing our departure. The storm had passed, leaving the forest dripping and ethereal in the late afternoon light. Our electronics suddenly functioned again once we crossed some invisible boundary. Ben immediately radioed headquarters, reporting that we'd found the hiker, disoriented but safe, making no mention of what we'd witnessed. "No one would believe us," he explained as we navigated back toward the ranger station. "Or worse, they would. Teams would come, researchers, military eventually, and these creatures would either be driven out or destroyed." That night, after returning the hiker to safety with a convenient story about getting lost in the storm, Ben and I sat on my cabin porch watching the distant tree line. The vocalizations had started again across the lake, complex patterns carried on the night air. "What do we do with this knowledge?" I asked. Ben was silent for a long moment. "We protect them by respecting the boundary. We divert trails, discourage off-path hiking, minimize human presence in their territory. We become guardians of the divide." "And if headquarters questions it?" "There are ways to maintain boundaries without explaining why," he said. "Environmental protection designations, endangered species habitat. We work within the system to create a buffer zone." In the months that followed, we did exactly that. Fabricated studies of sensitive ecosystem components, documented unstable terrain in key areas, created wildlife corridors that conveniently routed human activity away from the ancient heart of the forest. Meanwhile, I continued monitoring the boundary, noting how incursions decreased as our efforts took effect. Sometimes at dawn or dusk, I would catch glimpses of them watching from the tree line, not threatening but vigilant. Occasionally they would leave signs of their presence, arrangements of stones or branches that seemed to acknowledge our unspoken arrangement. I've remained at Whispering Pines long after Ben transferred to another park to implement similar boundary protections there. My cabin at the edge of the wilderness has become more than just a ranger station. It's an outpost between worlds, maintaining a fragile peace. The creatures still vocalize at night, their sounds carrying across Obsidian Lake. I've begun to recognize patterns, even meaning in some combinations. Not quite language as we understand it, but communication nonetheless. Sometimes I find myself responding with my own calls, creating a dialogue of sorts across the divide. Most rangers still don't last more than a season here. They sense something watching from the forest, feel the weight of ancient eyes upon them. They hear the sounds at night and request transfers to busier, more developed parks. I remain. I keep the boundary. I protect both worlds from the chaos that would come from their collision. And sometimes, on still nights when the moon illuminates the clearing between my cabin and the ancient forest, I catch glimpses of a massive silhouette at the tree line, acknowledging my presence as I acknowledge theirs. Two sentinels guarding the same border from opposite sides. The true guardians of these woods have always been here. I'm just the latest in a long line of humans who have learned to recognize their rightful claim. In their shadow I found my purpose. Not to conquer the wilderness, but to ensure it remains wild enough for its original inhabitants to endure. I never planned to become a park ranger. Growing up in the suburbs with concrete underfoot and streetlights washing out the stars, the wilderness was a foreign concept, something that existed in documentaries and vacation brochures. But life has a strange way of rerouting your carefully laid plans when you least expect it. After college, I found myself drowning in student debt and a directionless career path. The job listing appeared in my email almost like an omen. Park ranger position open at Whispering Pines National Forest. Requirements: physical fitness, love of nature, ability to work independently for extended periods. The pay wasn't great, but it offered housing, a cabin on the edge of Lake Stillwater, and a chance to escape the suffocating monotony of city life. 3 weeks later, I was driving a government-issue truck along winding mountain roads, watching as civilization gradually disappeared in my rearview mirror. Cell service dropped to a single flickering bar before vanishing altogether. The radio static increased until I switched it off, preferring the sound of wind through my open window. The cabin exceeded my expectations. Rustic but solidly built, it sat on a small rise overlooking the lake, surrounded by towering pines and ancient oaks. A generous porch wrapped around 3 sides, offering spectacular views of both water and wilderness. Inside, the furnishings were simple but comfortable. A worn leather couch, a wooden dining table, a double bed with thick quilts, and a pot-bellied stove for heat. Solar panels provided limited electricity, and a satellite phone offered my only connection to the outside world. "You'll get used to the isolation," my supervisor said after helping me unload my few possessions. "Some rangers can't handle it, but those who can never want to leave." He paused, glancing toward the dense forest beyond the cabin. "Just stick to the established trails when you're patrolling. Easy to get turned around in there, especially as winter approaches." The first few weeks passed in a blur of training, mapping trails, and learning the rhythms of the forest. I met the other rangers during our weekly check-ins, a diverse group who shared my appreciation for solitude and natural beauty. We were each assigned different sectors of the expansive wilderness, our cabins strategically placed to cover the most territory. It was during my 3rd month that I began to notice something off about my section of forest. At first, just subtle irregularities. Broken branches too high up for deer, unexplained silence from normally chattering birds, the occasional footprint that didn't match any known wildlife in the area. I documented everything according to protocol, but received little interest from headquarters. "Probably just a bear passing through," was the standard response, though I'd seen bear tracks before, and these were different, much larger, with 5 distinct toes and an almost human-like arch. The incident that changed everything happened on a brisk October evening. I was returning from a long day of trail maintenance, the fading light casting long shadows through the trees. The temperature had dropped sharply, my breath visible in clouds as I navigated the familiar path to my cabin. The silence hit me first. the complete absence of insect sounds, bird calls, even the usual rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The forest held its breath around me, waiting. Then came the smell, a powerful, musky odor unlike anything I'd encountered before. Not the decay of rotting vegetation or the distinct scent of any known animal, but something primal and wrong that triggered an instinctive fear response. I quickened my pace, fighting the urge to run. Running would be a mistake. Whatever was out there might give chase. The cabin was less than half a mile away, its chimney just visible through the trees. The snap of a branch behind me shattered my composure. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the gathering darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. But I knew with absolute certainty I wasn't alone. Something massive moved just beyond the reach of my light, circling, watching. I caught glimpses, a shadow darker than the surrounding forest, movement where nothing should be moving, the brief reflection of eyes much higher off the ground than any normal predator. I backed away slowly, maintaining the beam in the direction of the disturbance. When the cabin finally came into view, I allowed myself to pick up speed, not looking back until I'd crossed the threshold and slammed the door behind me, securing every lock with trembling hands. That night, something circled my cabin for hours. Heavy footsteps on the porch, breathing at the windows, testing the door with enough force to make the hinges creak in protest. I sat in the dark, shotgun across my lap, radio useless with the storm that had moved in, bringing sheets of rain that drummed against the roof. By morning, the presence had vanished, leaving only massive, mud-filled footprints disappearing into the forest and deep scratches in the wooden door frame. I photographed everything, knowing how it would sound to others, questioning my own sanity, even as I documented the evidence. What I didn't know then was that this encounter was merely the beginning. Something had claimed this forest as its territory long before humans drew boundaries and designated it a national park. Something that didn't appreciate our presence, especially as winter approached and resources grew scarce. And somehow, I had caught its attention. The weekly ranger meetup became my lifeline after that first encounter. Scheduled for every Thursday at the main station, these gatherings provided not just an organizational function, but served as a crucial reminder that I wasn't completely alone in this vast wilderness. After 5 days of isolation, the sound of human voices felt almost jarring. "You look like you've seen a ghost," said Maya, sliding a steaming mug of coffee across the table toward me. Filipino by birth but raised in Vancouver, she managed the eastern sector of the park with quiet efficiency. Her cabin sat beside a series of waterfalls, the constant white noise becoming such a part of her daily experience that she claimed to hear it even during her infrequent trips to civilization. "Not a ghost," I replied, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "Something else." The main station's common room grew quiet as I recounted my experience, describing the footprints, the scratches on my door, the overwhelming sense of being hunted. I'd brought photos, though the rain had washed away much of the detail, leaving only indistinct depressions in the mud. "Sounds like you've met our local legend," said Rory, an Australian transplant who'd been working the park for nearly a decade. His weathered face creased with an expression I couldn't quite read, not quite amusement, not quite concern. "The old-timers around here call it Shadow Walker." "Shadow Walker?" I repeated, an involuntary chill following the words. "Indigenous name," explained Zach, the youngest of our group. Born on a reservation 300 miles north, he joined the ranger service straight out of high school. "My grandfather used to tell stories about it. Said it was a spirit of the forest that took physical form, walking between worlds, appearing only to those who were about to face a great challenge or change." "I'm not really interested in facing either," I said, attempting humor that fell flat in the suddenly serious atmosphere. Rory leaned forward, voice dropping. "Listen, I'm not saying I believe all the legends, but something is out there. Been patrolling these forests for years, and I've seen things that don't line up with known wildlife. Structures that no human made, areas where nothing grows despite perfect conditions, nights when every animal for miles goes completely silent at once." "Have you ever seen it clearly?" I asked, not entirely sure I wanted the answer. "Once," he nodded slowly. 5 years back, during that record snowfall. Got caught in a blizzard, visibility down to nothing. Thought I was headed toward my cabin, but I'd gotten turned around. Would have frozen to death for sure, but then I spotted a light through the snow. Followed it to a cave I'd never noticed before. As I approached the entrance, I saw it, standing there, massive, watching me. 8, maybe 9 feet tall, covered in dark fur, with eyes that... He paused, shaking his head. Look, I know how this sounds, but it led me to shelter, then disappeared back into the storm. By morning, no tracks, no sign it had ever been there. Maya touched his arm gently. You never told us that part before. Some things you keep to yourself if you want to keep your job, he replied with a shrug. Official reports don't have categories for unexplained encounters with folklore. The conversation shifted to more practical matters, trail conditions, upcoming weather, supply needs, but I sensed a subtle change in how the others regarded me. I'd been initiated into something, witnessed something that marked me as truly belonging to this place. After the meeting, Zach approached me privately, pressing a small leather pouch into my hand. My grandfather made this, he said quietly. Protection against forest spirits. Hang it above your door. I thanked him, touched by the gesture, even if I wasn't sure I believed in spiritual protection. Yet when I returned to my cabin that evening, I hung the pouch exactly as instructed, finding unexpected comfort in the small act. That night I dreamed of running through the forest, pursued by something I couldn't see but could sense drawing ever closer. I woke gasping, sheets damp with sweat despite the chill in the cabin. As consciousness fully returned, I realized what had woken me. A sound from outside. Not the wind, not an animal on the porch, but something else. Wood striking wood. Rhythmic. Deliberate. Coming from the edge of the forest surrounding my cabin. I crept to the window, drawing the curtain back just enough to peer out. The moon provided sufficient light to see the tree line clearly, but revealed nothing unusual. Yet the sound continued, hollow impacts like someone knocking a stick against a tree trunk. 3 strikes, pause, 2 strikes, pause, 3 strikes again. A pattern, a message. As I watched, searching for the source, a movement caught my eye. Something stepping from behind a massive pine at the exact edge of visibility. The silhouette was unmistakably humanoid, but far too large, its proportions wrong in ways that sent ice through my veins. It raised an arm, gripping what looked like a broken branch, and struck it against the tree once more. 3 deliberate impacts that seemed to echo across the clearing between us. I let the curtain fall back into place and retreated to my bed, understanding implicitly that I'd witnessed an invitation, or perhaps a warning. Sleep never returned that night, and by dawn, I'd made a decision. If I was going to survive out here, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. It was time to do some research of my own. The regional library in the nearest town, a generous term for the cluster of buildings 40 miles from my cabin, housed a surprisingly robust collection of local history. I'd taken a rare personal day, citing equipment maintenance as my excuse, though my supervisor's knowing look suggested he understood more than I'd shared officially. Take your time, he'd said, signing off on my request. Sometimes a ranger needs perspective. Distance helps with that. The library basement contained archives stretching back to the earliest European settlements, alongside a careful collection of indigenous accounts transcribed by anthropologists in the early 1900s. The elderly librarian raised an eyebrow at my requested materials, but offered no comment beyond, "Those haven't been checked out in years." Hours passed as I pored over brittle newspapers, faded journals, and academic papers yellowed with age. Patterns emerged slowly. Disappearances that occurred in cycles, roughly every 20 years. Hunters who ventured into specific valleys never returning. Logging operations abandoned after workers refused to continue, citing unexplained phenomena. And always, whispered accounts of something watching from the trees. One journal entry from 1887 particularly caught my attention, written by a surveyor mapping the region. The guide refuses to continue north beyond the Twin Peaks. When pressed, he finally admitted the tribal elders consider that valley forbidden ground. The shadow goes there to sleep, he said, waking only when humans disturb its rest. When it wakes hungry, it does not quickly return to slumber. Superstitious nonsense, of course, yet I find myself reluctant to proceed alone. 2 weeks later, the surveyor's final entry read simply, "Something follows us. The men have heard it for 3 nights. Tomorrow, I go to see for myself." The journal ended there. According to newspaper accounts filed under the same date, the survey team was never found, despite an extensive search. More recent reports used different language but described similar experiences. In 1978, a group of hikers recorded audio of strange vocalizations near their campsite, described as between a howl and speech with deliberate inflection patterns. The original recording had been lost, but the transcript noted the sounds continued for nearly an hour before suddenly stopping, followed immediately by an unnatural silence, as though all wildlife simultaneously ceased activity. My phone buzzed, startling me from my research. A text from Maya. "Where are you? Check your radio. Everyone's looking." I'd been so absorbed I hadn't noticed the afternoon slipping away. Outside, the sky had darkened prematurely, a storm front moving in faster than forecast. I gathered my notes quickly, photographing pages I hadn't had time to properly review, and hurried to my truck. The drive back was treacherous, rain lashing the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it, the road becoming a river in sections. I was still 20 minutes from my cabin when the radio crackled to life. "Repeat, all rangers secure stations immediately. Flash flood warning issued for north and eastern sectors. Mandatory evacuation for zones 3 through 5. Acknowledge." I recognized Zach's voice, tense but professional, and grabbed the handset. "This is Zone 6 responding. En route to station now. Status?" "Where have you been?" Relief evident in his tone. "Storm hit the mountains hard. Dam operators releasing pressure. Lake's already risen 2 feet. Your cabin should be elevated enough, but access road might flood. Get there and stay put." The last mile to my cabin became increasingly difficult, water pooling in deepening puddles across the dirt road. By the time I parked, rain was coming down in sheets, the roar nearly deafening as it drummed against the truck's roof. I made a dash for the porch, soaked completely in the short distance. Inside, I quickly lit the stove for warmth and changed into dry clothes. The satellite phone showed no signal, the storm interfering with connection. I was effectively cut off until conditions improved. As darkness fell completely, the storm's intensity somehow increased. Wind howled around the cabin's corners, finding every crack and seam, creating eerie whistles and moans. I checked the windows and doors twice, then settled in for a long night, reviewing my research notes by lantern light as the electricity flickered and finally failed. That's when I noticed it, a detail from one of the tribal accounts I'd photographed but hadn't fully read. A description of how the shadow walker communicated. It speaks through the forest itself, through hollow wood struck against trees, through stones clacking together, through the controlled movement of water and wind. Those who learn to listen can hear its warnings. The knocking I'd heard nights before suddenly took on new significance. Not a threat, but communication. But what was it trying to tell me? A tremendous crash outside jolted me from my thoughts. I grabbed my flashlight, pointing it toward the window. Through the curtain of rain, I could just make out that a massive tree had fallen across the access road, narrowly missing my truck. No leaving now, even if evacuation orders came through. Another crash, closer this time. Another tree down, this one at the edge of the clearing beside my cabin. The storm wasn't natural. Or rather, the storm was natural, but its targets seemed suspiciously specific, blocking all potential escape routes. The flashlight beam caught something else as I scanned the damage, movement at the forest edge. A figure, impossibly tall, barely distinguishable from the surrounding trees except when it moved. It stood watching the cabin, seemingly unbothered by the torrential downpour. And then it raised its arm, pointing deliberately toward the lake. I turned my beam in that direction and felt my heart drop. The water had risen dramatically, already covering half the distance between the normal shoreline and my cabin. If the dam continued releasing pressure, this entire area would be underwater within hours. The realization hit me with horrifying clarity. I wasn't being threatened by the entity in the forest. I was being warned. But why would it care if I survived? The lake continued rising at an alarming rate. By midnight, water had crept to within 50 yards of the cabin porch, transforming the surrounding forest into a dark lagoon. Trees stood like sentinels in the shallows, their reflections creating disorienting mirror images when caught in my flashlight beam. I'd packed essential supplies, water, food, first aid kit, extra clothing, into a waterproof backpack, and kept my shotgun close at hand. Not that it would offer much protection against rising floodwaters, but its solid weight provided psychological comfort against other potential threats. The rain had finally slackened, though wind still moaned through the trees with unnatural persistence. I stood on the porch, calculating options. The road was impassable, the lake advancing from the south, dense forest to the east. Only the northwest route offered higher ground, but that path led deeper into the territory where I'd encountered the Shadow Walker. The irony wasn't lost on me. My only escape route led directly toward what I'd been avoiding. A subtle splashing sound drew my attention back to the flooded forest edge. Something large was moving through the water, approaching the cabin from the southeast, the opposite direction from where I'd last seen the tall figure. Whatever this was moved differently, lower to the ground with a predatory grace. I raised my flashlight, catching a brief glimpse of sleek, dark movement before it submerged. Not human, not the Shadow Walker, but something else entirely. Something that used the flood to its advantage. The realization struck with chilling clarity. I wasn't dealing with just one unknown entity in these woods. A deep, reverberating sound echoed across the water. Not quite a howl, not quite a roar, but something between that raised the hair on my neck. It came from the northwest, from the direction of higher ground, from the Shadow Walker's territory. The splashing near the cabin stopped immediately. Whatever had been approaching retreated, water churning as it changed direction and disappeared back into the flooded forest. The message seemed clear. Territorial boundaries existed even among the unknown predators of these woods, and for whatever reason, the Shadow Walker had just defended its claim. On me. I had little time to contemplate this development. The water had reached the bottom step of the porch, the cabin now effectively an island in a rising sea. My decision was made for me, northwest, toward higher ground, toward whatever awaited me there. I secured the cabin as best I could, though I harbored no illusions about returning anytime soon. With backpack strapped tight, shotgun in hand, and a powerful flashlight to guide my way, I set off through knee-deep water toward the gradually rising forest floor beyond. The going was treacherous. Hidden obstacles beneath the murky water threatened to trip me with each step. Twice I nearly lost my balance, the weight of the pack threatening to pull me under. By the time I reached slightly elevated ground, my boots and pants were soaked through, adding uncomfortable weight to my already difficult journey. The forest here grew denser, older. Massive trees blocked much of the remaining wind, creating an eerie stillness broken only by the distant sound of rushing water and my own labored breathing. I moved as quietly as possible, following what appeared to be a game trail that wound upward through increasingly rocky terrain. An hour into my trek, I reached a small clearing dominated by a massive boulder. Exhaustion forced a brief rest. I leaned against the stone, its surface strangely warm despite the cool night air, and took a long drink from my water bottle. That's when I noticed the markings, subtle indentations in the boulder's surface, too regular to be natural erosion. I traced them with my fingers, recognizing primitive symbols similar to those I'd seen in the library archives. This was a marker of some kind, deliberately placed and maintained. A slight sound from the trees behind me, the soft crush of leaves underfoot, sent me spinning around, shotgun raised instinctively. Nothing visible in my flashlight beam, but the feeling of being watched intensified dramatically. I backed away from the boulder, continuing along the path, pace quickening despite my fatigue. The trail steepened sharply, becoming more rock than soil as it wound up what I now recognized as one of the twin peaks mentioned in the surveyor's journal. The Forbidden Valley would lie just beyond. Every instinct urged retreat, but the flooded lowlands behind me offered no sanctuary. Forward was my only option. Near the summit, the trail abruptly ended at a rock face that appeared solid at first glance. Closer inspection revealed a narrow opening, a crevice just wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. Cool air flowed from the gap, carrying that same musky scent I'd detected during my first encounter. I hesitated, flashlight beam probing the darkness beyond. The opening appeared to lead to a cave system, potentially dry shelter, but also a perfect trap. A sound from behind made the decision for me, the unmistakable splash of something large moving through water far below, advancing quickly up the trail I'd just climbed. Whatever had retreated earlier had apparently changed its mind about territorial boundaries. I slipped through the crevice, finding myself in a narrow tunnel that widened after several yards into a surprisingly large cavern. My flashlight revealed walls covered in more elaborate versions of the symbols from the boulder outside, curving lines, handprints, stylized figures that seemed to tell a story I couldn't decipher. The cave extended deeper into the mountain, but a smaller opening to my right revealed a ledge overlooking the valley beyond. I moved cautiously toward it, seeking a defensive position with visibility. What I saw from that vantage point defied explanation. The valley below, protected from the storm by surrounding peaks, contained structures, not human dwellings, but not entirely natural formations either. Massive trees had been bent and intertwined to create shelter-like spaces. Stone arrangements formed patterns visible even from my elevated position. And moving among these structures were figures, tall, powerful forms that walked upright yet were clearly not human. I counted 7 distinct individuals, varying in size but all massive compared to human proportions. They moved with purpose, some gathering around what appeared to be a central meeting area, others standing watch at various points around the valley perimeter. A community. An actual organized community of creatures that weren't supposed to exist. I must have made some sound, a gasp of surprise, a shift of equipment, because suddenly, as though choreographed, every figure in the valley below froze and turned in my direction. I retreated from the opening, heart pounding, pressing myself against the cave wall. Too late. They'd detected my presence. The question now was whether they would come for me or simply wait for me to leave their territory. Heavy footsteps answered that question, approaching the base of the mountain below my position. They were coming. And from the sounds echoing up from the valley, they were coming in numbers. I readied my shotgun, though I harbored no illusions about its effectiveness against multiple adversaries of their size. As the footsteps grew closer, I realized I had only moments to decide. Stay and confront what was coming, or attempt to flee back the way I'd come, potentially straight into the path of the water predator. A deep, resonant sound echoed through the cave. 3 distinct knocks against stone. The same pattern I'd heard that night by my cabin, a communication, perhaps even an announcement of presence. "I mean no harm," I called out, voice steadier than I expected. "I was forced here by the flood." Silence followed my words, then another series of knocks, different pattern this time. Responding? Questioning? A massive shadow fell across the cave entrance. I raised my flashlight, illuminating what stood there. 9 feet tall at minimum, broad-shouldered and powerful, covered in dark fur that held the sheen of recent rain. Its face was more expressive than I'd anticipated, deep-set eyes reflecting my light with amber intelligence, a heavy brow, a mouth that seemed capable of both bestial roars and more nuanced vocalizations. The Shadow Walker had found me, and somehow I knew with perfect clarity that my fate would be decided in the next few moments. Time stretched between us as we regarded each other, human and not human, both intelligent species sharing an unexpected proximity neither had planned. I lowered my shotgun slowly, deliberately placing it on the ground beside me, a peace offering, or perhaps simply an acknowledgement of its uselessness in the situation. The creature, I could no longer think of it as simply a monster or beast, made a sound low in its throat, almost thoughtful. Then, with movements that displayed surprising dexterity, it raised its massive hands and formed a series of gestures. Sign language, I realized with shock, not American Sign Language as I knew it, but something similar in concept, deliberate hand movements conveying meaning. It repeated the sequence, slower this time, clearly expecting comprehension. "I don't understand," I said quietly, then mimicked confusion with my own hands, palms up, shoulders raised. The Shadow Walker tilted its head, considering. Then it extended one long arm, pointing first at me, then making a sweeping gesture toward the valley below, followed by a clear negative motion. Head shake, hand waved in prohibition. The message seemed obvious. "You don't belong here." "The flood," I explained, pantomiming rising water, then pointed back down the mountain. "I couldn't stay." Another series of gestures, more complex this time, but ending with that same sweeping motion toward the valley, the same prohibition. "I'll leave when I can," I promised, making walking motions with my fingers, then pointing away from the valley. "When the water recedes." The creature seemed to consider this, massive chest rising and falling with deep breaths. Then, unexpectedly, it lowered itself to a seated position at the cave entrance, effectively blocking the only exit, but making its posture less threatening. We had reached a temporary truce, it seemed. Minutes passed in silence. I remained pressed against the wall, hyper-aware of every sound and movement. The shadow walker occasionally shifted position, but maintained its vigilant watch. From outside came other sounds, calls exchanged between unseen entities in the valley below, presumably the others I'd glimpsed earlier. Finally, I ventured a question, keeping my voice low and calm. "What are you?" The creature's eyes, remarkably expressive, regarded me with what I could only interpret as weary resignation, as if this question had been asked by humans throughout centuries, with never a satisfactory answer possible across the species divide. Instead of attempting explanation, it reached toward one of the wall markings near the entrance, a stylized figure with long limbs standing beside a much smaller human form. It touched the larger figure, then placed that same hand against its own chest. "Identity. You've been here a long time," I said, understanding dawning. "Before us." A slow, deliberate nod, a human gesture it had learned through observation, I realized. Communication adapted to cross the barrier between our kinds. More pieces fell into place as I studied the wall markings visible from my position. They weren't just symbols, but a recorded history, showing the arrival of indigenous peoples, coexistence, then conflict as European settlers pushed into the territory. "The floods," I said suddenly, remembering the cyclical disappearances in the records. "They happen regularly, every 20 years or so. You know when they're coming." The creature made a rumbling sound, neither confirmation nor denial, but its eyes remained fixed on mine with unmistakable intelligence. "You warned me," I continued, the realization striking deeper. "The knocking at night, pointing to the lake. You were warning me about the flood." This time, a definite nod. "But why?" The question escaped before I could consider whether it might cause offense. "Why warn me specifically?" The shadow walker rose in a fluid motion that belied its size, moving deeper into the cave rather than toward me. It gestured for me to follow, its meaning unmistakable despite the absence of words. Hesitantly, I obeyed, keeping a cautious distance as we moved through the main cavern toward another passage I hadn't noticed previously. This tunnel sloped upward, climbing further into the mountain, occasionally branching into smaller chambers before continuing. Finally, we emerged into a space that stole my breath. A vast underground chamber where crystals embedded in the ceiling caught and amplified my flashlight beam, creating an ethereal, starlit effect. But it wasn't the natural beauty that held me transfixed. The walls of this chamber contained the most elaborate markings yet, not just symbols and figures, but something approaching written language. And interspersed among these indigenous-style records were more recent additions, pages from books, maps, photographs, all carefully preserved behind protective coverings of what appeared to be handcrafted resin. A library. A historical record maintained by creatures humanity had relegated to myth. The shadow walker moved to one section of wall, indicating a collection of more recent items. I approached cautiously, flashlight revealing newspaper clippings, official-looking documents, and photographs that documented the establishment of the national park. Among them was a familiar face, my supervisor, decades younger, standing beside a much older ranger. Both were pointing at a map, unaware of the camera capturing their image. The creature tapped the photograph, then made a gesture I interpreted as connection or relationship. "My supervisor knew about you," I whispered, understanding flooding through me. That's why he wasn't concerned when I reported strange findings. He already knew. A slow nod confirmed my suspicion. "The ranger position? It wasn't random that I got this assignment, was it? You've been watching us, watching you." The shadow walker made a sound almost like a sigh, then indicated another photograph. This one showing a cabin that looked remarkably like mine, but from decades earlier, with a different ranger standing on its porch. Beside this was pinned a more disturbing image, The same cabin partially submerged in floodwater, rescue personnel retrieving what was clearly a body. The last flood, I murmured. The ranger didn't survive. The creature touched the image of the dead ranger, then pointed to the cave around us, then back at the photograph. The meaning seemed clear. They had tried to warn that ranger too, but failed. History they didn't want to repeat. A relationship, I said slowly. You need rangers who understand what's really in these woods, who know when to keep secrets. The shadow walker's eyes held mine, measuring, judging. Then it extended a massive hand toward me, not touching, but offering something I hadn't noticed it carrying. A small wooden object, intricately carved into a shape resembling the symbols on the cave walls. A token, an identification, perhaps even an invitation. I accepted it carefully, feeling the weight of implications far heavier than the object itself. What happens now? I asked quietly. The creature made a series of gestures I interpreted as, wait, return when safe. And after that, when I go back to my duties? Its final gesture was simple but unmistakable, an open hand extended toward the valley, the prohibition notably absent. Access granted, with conditions understood but unspoken. Knowledge shared, but with responsibility attached. When dawn finally broke, the rain had stopped completely. From the mountain ledge, I could see the floodwaters already beginning to recede, revealing damage throughout the forest below. My cabin still stood, though surrounded by water and debris. Recovery would take weeks. Of my unusual guide, there was no sign. It had led me to a safe observation point, then disappeared back into shadowed passages with deliberate footsteps that gradually faded to silence. I clutched the wooden token in my pocket, its edges already smooth from my unconscious handling. Tangible proof that I hadn't imagined the night's events, though I knew better than to share it, or any of what I'd experienced, with anyone except perhaps my supervisor, who clearly had secrets of his own to explain. The forest I'd thought I knew was transformed irrevocably in my perception. Not just trees and wildlife and scenic vistas for tourists to photograph, but a complex ecosystem where humans were neither the first inhabitants nor the most mysterious. As I began the careful descent toward what remained of the normal world, I understood with perfect clarity that I would never leave this place, not permanently. The Shadow Walker had marked me not as prey but as something far more complicated, a bridge between worlds, a keeper of necessary secrets. And in the deepest wilderness, where ancient eyes watched from shadows between the trees, that role might prove the most important work of my life.